451. Chapter 451. This change hadn't gone unnoticed by his friends, and Ron was the first to confront him on it. "Is everything all right, Nick? You've been a bit odd of late," the redhead asked in the workshop on the 1st of December. "Yeah, everything's fine. My schedule is just getting to me, I suppose," Nick said with a sigh. "Don't you only have class 2 days a week, though?" Tracy asked, confused. "Not that schedule, the one I set for myself when I am not in class or here making rings of protection," Nick specified. "Sounds like you need to take a break from whatever part of this schedule of yours that has you acting uncomfortably similar to Snape," Daphne said seriously, and everyone nodded. Nick didn't argue, since if it was that bad he probably should take a break from Slytherin's library for a while. "Maybe I should hold another match," Nick suggested, and everyone perked up. "Oh yeah, you wouldn't believe how many people ask the rest of us when you would be holding another one of those," Tracy complained. "I assumed that the teams would have scheduled one by now, since that is how it works if there isn't a tournament," Nick said with a shrug. "You never said that," everyone yelled at the same time. Nick shook his head. "No, it's on the rules I wrote, see," he said while pulling out the rules handbook that had been published by the ministry. Flipping through it to the last page, Nick pointed at the rule he was talking about. "All non-tournament matches are to be decided upon by the teams participating beforehand." "Why in Merlin's name is that the last rule?" Tracy exclaimed in frustration. Nick shrugged. "I wrote the rules assuming that they would all get read, so it's not my fault nobody did," he said with a chuckle. His friends all left after that to spread the word on this rule that had been overlooked this entire time through the school. Nick found it a bit funny how much of an uproar this created, as everyone who had been hoping for a new match to watch confronted the teams themselves over it. The team captains all looked like they ate lemons with the sour expressions they had. The best part is that they had no one to blame but themselves for not paying attention to that rule. So it was that a new match was finally announced between the Mermen and the Krakens for the upcoming Saturday. Funny thing was that only the students and those who hadn't read the entirety of the rules didn't know about the scheduling rule. The rest of the world that had started training teams and assembling the fields using Nick's blueprints was actually aware of this rule, and using it to thoroughly prepare for the first official international tournament in the future. Nobody knew exactly when it was going to be held, but there were rumors that the international Quidditch tournament was going to be held with it as well. Nick relaxed during the week when he wasn't making rings or in class by hanging out with his friends and slowly digesting the information within the Daedric realm book he had. Hermione kept bothering him about it when she caught a glimpse of the dense scrawl in the book. Stuff about how he should stop reading something written in demonic lettering and hypocritically curious what it was about. It was funny to everyone how her two sides clashed so heavily with this topic, as she wanted him to be safe, but at the same time, her inner knowledge hound wanted to know what information was held within. Obviously, Nick didn't tell her what the book was about, since, for one, it was so over her head that it wasn't even possible for her to understand. Second, he was planning to use the nigh immortality of binding himself to the realm as his ace in the hole for the future. After all, he doubted that anyone, even Zeus, would expect someone they killed to suddenly come out of nowhere in a surprise attack. Unlike Hades, Zeus had no known connection to souls, so he probably wouldn't even notice it if he destroyed Nick's body, but the soul slipped away safely. Nick had thought of trying to grant his friends immortality, or at the least agelessness, but figured he should wait until after he dealt with Zeus for that sort of thing. In an excellent piece of news, there was a thunderstorm predicted to come in a few days, and Nick was ready to take the step forward into becoming an Animagus. 452. Chapter 452. Nick was confident that he would finish the ritual without any trouble thanks to his preparations. Still, he wanted to be in his best condition for the day he started the transformation, and thus didn't do anything that taxed him in any way. He simply spent the next 3 days hanging out with his friends and helping them with their homework and personal projects. Ron, for example, was experimenting with cores to see if he could find another supreme core besides those that Ollivander has listed. Nick doubted that this would turn up anything, considering that Ollivander definitely conducted similar experiments before. Tracy was focusing on fully mastering the basics of metalwork, while Daphne and Hermione were starting to experiment with creating runic lines without help. Nick had to point out the few horrible mistakes they made a few times, but overall, it was fairly good work. Harry and Luna were instead focused on personalizing their combat styles. This was more complex than it sounded, as while using the generally taught form of magical combat could take one far, it was a fact that the real powerhouse fighters like Dumbledore and Grindelwald had their own styles. The reason for this was that people were each different than each other, and thus even if it was small, the style used should change to fit the one using it. For Harry, this showed up in the form of focused attacks, but loose wand movement. For Luna, it was a sort of organized chaos with a vast mix of wand movements and body positions. Out of the two, Luna's developing style was by far the hardest to come against. It was a bit like trying to fight the currents of an ocean or the movement of the wind. Sure, you could shift it, but never stop it entirely, as both of those things were fluid and ever adapting to whatever was placed before them. It was actually quite impressive, as Luna went from being almost on par with Harry to suppressing him 6 times out of 10, and that number was only growing as she further refined her style. Soon enough, though, the day finally came, and as promised, lightning flashed across the sky from the storm. Nick retrieved the potion that had turned a strange, mushy purple, and ignoring the disgusting contents, downed it. Immediately he felt an intense heat rise from his stomach and spread throughout his body as if it was traveling through his veins. Badam! The sound of a heartbeat rang out from Nick's body, and while most would assume it came from his heart, he knew for certain that it wasn't the case. No, the sound came from his magical core, and then once again it appeared. Badam! 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 The sound grew more and more frequent as the heat spread throughout his body, until it seemed to echo from how often it appeared. Once the heat fully spread through Nick's body, the real changes started to happen. The familiar phenomena that he had incorporated into the ritual arrived as pain racked his body and soul. His skin grew thicker, and the fine hairs all over his body grew into feathers. His fingers fused together, and his arms elongated, while the bones became lighter but stronger throughout his body. His teeth grew outwards alongside his jaws before fusing together into a sharp beak. Nick's feet hardened, and his big toe and pinky toes fused with the toes next to them, while the middle toe grew wider and longer. The final large change was that Nick's entire body began to swell in size, while the proportions shifted into their new form. The transformation took nearly an entire hour, and when it finally ended, a 7-foot-tall bird with silver gray and golden feathers with black patterns and 2 sets of wings and long tail feathers stood within the room. "'Tis easy," Bird cried out, and the storm raging outside froze as if by command for the briefest moment. In the workshop, Dusk cried out as well, while in Dumbledore's office, Fox did the same. "So he succeeded then. I can't wait to see what form he took," the old wizard said with a small smile. Nick, meanwhile, calmed himself down after that instinctual cry of joy at his finished transformation. "It's odd how natural this feels. It's like I have always known how to walk with talons and fly with 4 wings." Nick, though, as he felt out his new form's movements, "Let's give that a go to see if my theory on where Nazgul got it from is correct." He thought before there was a bright flash of electric energy, and he was gone. Almost at the same time, there was another bright flash of electric energy at the Blitz Ball field ring as he manifested there. 453. Chapter 453. "Oh, that's disorienting as all hell," Nick thought as his mind registered the complete shift in environment. The snow falling from the sky melted on contact with his feathers as his body actively radiated a great deal of heat on its own. Nick noticed this, but thought it made sense if he was what he thought he was. So I was right, and Nazgul did get the elemental teleportation from the celestial bird part of me. He thought before mentally grinning as he spread his wings and flapped them hard. F-whoosh. A powerful gust of wind was created, pushing the falling snow aside from the power of this movement. Nick shot into the air as he flapped his wings and couldn't help but be happy to fly without any outside assistance. It was hard to describe, really, as it was like a weight had been lifted from him, and he suddenly felt light enough to touch the clouds above. "'Tis easier," he cried out as he poured on more and more speed. To his surprise, fire and lightning rose from his body as he pushed his speed to the limit before he felt something shatter and he watched the surroundings blur. Did I just break the sound barrier? He thought in amazement as he barely felt any resistance from the air at all despite reaching such a speed. He could still make out the surroundings as he passed by, but he couldn't focus on anything for more than a moment before it was already behind him. I shouldn't get too far from the school since I still need to turn back to normal, he thought as he banked sharply and unnaturally fast thanks to his second set of wings. Thanks to the storm, it was quite dim outside the castle, so when Nick re-entered its proximity, he drew a lot of attention. It would be rather difficult to ignore a brightly lit, giant avian creature flying stupidly fast outside the windows after all. Nick slowed down, which also caused the flames and lightning covering him to retreat within his body as he saw Dumbledore watching him from the astronomy tower. Landing gracefully on the unoccupied spot on the tower, Nick looked down at the headmaster smugly. I admit that it really is an extraordinary form that well suits you, but remember that there is a reason wizards are considered superior, Dumbledore said sternly. Nick's form rippled, and he returned to his normal state with a small difference in that his nails remained hard and dark in color. Way to kill the mood, and here I was enjoying myself, Nick complained before they chuckling. Out of curiosity, how'd you know to wait for me here? He then asked, confused. Fox was quite vocal in celebrating your success, which told me all I needed to know, Dumbledore said honestly. Species resonance, huh? Nifty. Nick said, surprised to a degree, but after thinking about it, it made sense. Immortal birds were all highly independent, so it makes sense that they could feel the proximity of other members of their races. Otherwise, there would probably be a lot of incidents involving them fighting, considering the global traveling the phoenixes do on the regular. So is this the part where I hand over the modified ritual to you so you can turn into a phoenix or nah? Nick asked casually. What would make you think I want that? Dumbledore asked with a look of interest. Please don't act like not being able to take the form of your patroness was not the only reason you, a master of transfiguration, haven't undergone the ritual yourself, Nick said with a scoff. Dumbledore chuckled. I cannot deny that, but I am not the sort to take the hard-earned merit of another, he said with a small smile. Oh, believe me, I know, which is why I am waiting for you to make an offer for the knowledge instead, Nick said casually. It seems like you understand me quite well, and yet I find you difficult to fully decipher. Don't misunderstand me, I hold you in high regard for the way you act despite your many talents and power. You are arrogant, true, but compared to how you could be instead, it is far from unacceptable, Dumbledore said bluntly. Nick was taken off guard by this, as like himself, Dumbledore prefers to speak vaguely most of the time. Still, Nick couldn't deny that the old goat was right, however, as while he was quite prideful, he could be so much worse considering his unique situation. Be that as it may, I believe we are getting off topic, the ritual, Nick reminded, and Dumbledore smiled. You'll have to forgive me, I tend to get caught up in my thoughts during a conversation. Yes, I would like to use your ritual, but under the condition it not be made public, he said calmly. 454. Chapter 454. Nick scoffed at that. I can't even reveal my own transformation at the moment. Why would I reveal yours and make people suspicious? Not saying you aren't skilled or anything, but you haven't made any publicly known strides in magic in a long time, and yet you suddenly figured out how to turn into a magical creature via the Animagus ritual, suspicious as hell, Nick said honestly. I suppose you are right, but it wouldn't be the first time you've used my past to cause me harm, Dumbledore pointed out with a chuckle. Nick winced at that. That might have been a bit far in hindsight, but to be fair, you crossed that line first, he said honestly. I suppose I did, but enough beating the bush, as the Muggles say. We have a trade to make, Dumbledore said, butchering a phrase while he was at it. It's beating around the bush, and yeah, we should probably get this over with. Remove the age limit for the tournament next year, and I'll call it even, Nick said with a shrug. This seemed to catch Dumbledore off guard, as he hadn't expected Nick to even know about the Triwizard Tournament, much less one of its rules. Ironically, that alone will not allow you to participate in the tournament, as the other two schools participating have insisted that you not be allowed to participate, Dumbledore said honestly. It was Nick's turn to be caught off guard this time, as he wasn't expecting something like this at all. "Have they said why they don't want me to participate?" he asked curiously. "I believe the consensus reached was for the fairness of the other participants, though I imagine it is more likely because they lack confidence of victory should you participate," Dumbledore said honestly. "Well, as it would happen, I wasn't planning to participate personally for that exact reason. I am not a fan of bullying after all. No, in fact, I was hoping to have Harry take part instead," Nick explained calmly. Dumbledore looked confused. "While he shows a high level of proficiency in dueling, I don't see any indication of him being ready for such a challenging endeavor," the old goat said seriously. "Do you know what is holding Harry back the most right now in regards to his magical capabilities?" Nick asked, and Dumbledore shook his head. "It's experience and imagination. Harry's journey as a wizard has been fairly smooth past the first year, and as a result, he lacks the experiences and creativity that would have accelerated his prowess by leagues at this point. He is ahead of most other third-year students, but nowhere near where he would be if he had been given true challenges to overcome," Nick said honestly. This was true too, as by this point in the canon timeline Harry was already learning the Patronus charm and showing off incredibly amounts of mana for his age. Now, however, Harry was more skilled with what he knew, but lacked the edge he had in the canon timeline. Dumbledore seemed thoughtful after hearing this, and could understand why Nick would think it. Conflict made strong wizards, while peace made weak wizards that brought conflict in an endless cycle. Key was to have enough conflict for growth, but not enough to spark trouble. You hoped that the tournament might help Harry grow further then. An admirable idea, but what of Harry's own wishes in the matter? Perhaps he won't want to participate in the tournament to begin with. What then? Dumbledore asked, and Nick chuckled. Then that will be up to him. I only want to allow him the opportunity to reach his full potential. Whether he takes it or not is entirely up to him, Nick said with a shrug. "I see. Very well then, I shall see to it that the age requirement be lowered accordingly. After that, however, it will be up to Harry to enter the tournament or not," Dumbledore said with a smile. Nick casually took out a sheet of parchment and handed it over. "Just so you know, I had planned to give you the ritual regardless of what I got out of it, since it will prove useful to me in the future," Nick said before jumping off the tower and turning back to his Animagus form. There was one detail that even Dumbledore may have forgotten to think about if he succeeded in becoming a Phoenix Animagus. He may get the chance to exploit the magic to a degree and undergo nirvana like normal phoenixes do, which will return him to his prime without lowering his power at all. Nick, however, knew that he didn't have this option, since his very being will be tied to his realm instead, so he will be reconstituted from scratch, while Dumbledore will have to go through the youth stage again. 455. Chapter 455. This entire time, since the creature escaped from its prison, it had been moving slowly through the sea as it hunted down the magical beasts that dwelled within. All magic was its food, and nothing was an exception, so it was only after it stopped finding prey that its hunger finally led it to the northeastern shores of the British Isles. There, it came across its first wizard after it left the prison that it devoured with relish. This was merely the first of many, however, as it was soon discovered by the Ministry, and by extension Dumbledore. Stopping it, however, proved impossible, as even transfigurations that reshaped the ground it stood upon lost their magic and reverted to their original states. Nick learned of this when he and the powerful staff of Hogwarts were summoned to Dumbledore's office after the man had managed to send the creature to the northern Arctic Circle at the cost of most of his mana. The creature is as we feared and unable to be contained by magic. I tried everything I could, but I was only barely able to catch it off guard enough to banish it to the Arctic glaciers, but it is already on its way back, with a grudge this time it seems," the old man said with a tired look on his face. "My hands are also tied in this matter, as without causing a serious commotion, I have no way of taking care of the thing. In theory, it would be possible to use Muggle science to trap the creature, but they lack the level in it to make that possible," Nick said helplessly. "Why did you want a Muggle weapon then?" Dumbledore asked, confused. "That was because it burns through its magic each time it stops a non-magical attack, so it might be possible to force it to starve itself to death if it is hit with enough," Nick said honestly. Would that not put the one using the muggle weaponry in grave danger as the creature grew desperate? Snape asked with a heavy frown. That's where I am stuck, unfortunately, as to nullify the danger I would need a way trap the creature, and as Dumbledore will attest, that is not possible magically speaking. Using muggle means also won't work, as the thing will barely be slowed down with the current level of technology available. Nick explained, and everyone frowned. Albus, you said you managed to banish to the Arctic, but if it devours magic, how did you accomplish this? McGonagall asked, clearly having an idea. This creature has a maximum range that it can devour magic within. I used this to send a certain area of space to the Arctic that included the creature's location without directly using magic within its field. Hold on, you said it has a range, Nick said with his eyes lighting up. That is correct. What have you figured out? Dumbledore asked, hopeful. I may or may not be able to erase an area of existence if I can trap the creature in an area with looping space that should kill it, but it's a gamble, a large one at that. The enchantment, if you want to call it, that is highly volatile, so if even the tiniest speck of magic touches the ring, it could go off and take whoever was holding it with it, alongside 20 feet of existence. Nick said seriously, as everyone in the room looked horrified. Why would you create such a thing? Flitwick asked in confusion after getting past the horror that is an existence-erasing item. It was a failure I created in my first year at school that I never had the suicidal inclination to recreate. You need to understand that while I had the theoretical limits for the enchantment method I use, it was just that theory. So I could only determine fact from fiction via experiments. That one just ended poorly. Nick explained honestly. If possible, I think it best if we avoid resorting to such dangerous actions. However, the idea for a looping space might work to keep the creature contained until we can safely destroy it. I will seek aid from my old friend Nico in setting such a thing up. Dumbledore said seriously. I also like not being erased, so you have no arguments from me, though I have a large stockpile of star metal that might help if you require it. Nick offered, since if it meant that Abomination's eventual destruction, he was all for generously donating to the cause. That will be most appreciated, since the metal will make the work much easier. Dumbledore said with a smile. With that settled, I have a gift for you all, since I won't be participating in the standard Christmas gift giving this year. Nick said as he took out several small vials with a small stone in each. 456. Chapter 456. These stones were barely the size of a pebble, but seemed to glow with an eerie pale light. These small stones are the congealed magical energy taken from a certain star that shines from the sky at night. What they can do, though, is the really interesting part, however, as each one of these things can be used to empower the effects of a single piece of magic, be it potion, spell, enchantment, or alchemy, permanently. Catch, however, is that the stone is gone after a single use, and getting more is a pain in the neck like you wouldn't believe. Nick said with a smirk. How difficult could it be if it is from a star that shines every night? Lupin asked, confused. So as is common knowledge, the world spins on its axis and rotates around the sun. But relatively speaking, the stars don't move from their positions with the Earth in this orbit, and some actually only shine dimly, if at all, during very specific times of the year. These stones come from one such star, and thus are a huge pain to get. This is obviously not my entire stock of the stuff, but very precious nonetheless. Nick explained honestly. Nick had been lucky enough to find this star when he was experimenting with the Twilight method, but to his dismay, the star in question only popped up in the sky for a week every year. I think I know the perfect thing to use this for, thank you, Dumbledore said as he gazed at his own stone in fascination. The rest of the professors also expressed their thanks at the gift, which, while simple and the same for each of them, was also in a way personalized. The light material itself was unique as far as Nick could tell, as it held no magic itself and had no forms it preferred, but could empower any magic it was used with greatly. Nick himself had been tempted to use it on his realm, but he found out the hard way that it would have very little effect due to the nature of the realm. It had stopped being a simple enchantment after experiencing so much growth since its first creation, and was now a sort of pocket reality or plane of existence. Besides that, though Nick didn't find any of his usual works worthy of the material. As far as he was concerned, nothing below mythical grade was, and he didn't have any others at the moment. His wand was also not magical by itself, but a focus for his magic that in a way siphoned off his own magic to function. Not enough to matter, but the point stood. Perhaps I should think up a new mythical ring, but what? Nick thought off-handedly as he left the office. With the abomination needing to cross the ocean again, they had a bit more time to prepare, so Nick wasn't stressed about it. Plus, if the whole space looping thing worked out, then the abomination should starve to death, even without their assistance, if given enough time. Even if it didn't work so well, Nick still had options to get rid of it if he threw caution to the wind. The one he mentioned was one of them, but he could always stuff the abomination with enough magic for it to detonate in a grand explosion that will probably cause international issues between the Muggles. That doesn't even begin to cover the effects that such a vast amount of magic being unleashed in an area would do to it. Not even Nick knew the answer to that question, as there was no recorded instance of such a thing happening that he knew of. Still, once he got back to the workshop, Nick meditated while pondering a mythical item to create. I wonder if that would even work, he thought as he had an idea. Standing up, he grabbed an ingot of mithril and turned on the furnace and waited for it to warm up before switching the flame to purgatory flames and tossing the mithril in. Once the ingot was melted into an eerie white puddle, Nick transferred it to a wide, flat mold so that he could let it cool into a thin sheet of metal. Are you sure you want to do this? It may have far-reaching complications if you do, Celebrimber asked worriedly. Nick nodded. If it works, it might give me another ace up my sleeve. Nick said honestly, that's if it works at all. You might instead only create a cruel item of the darkest sort. Celebrimber warned seriously. It's a gamble, but one with a very high payout if it works as intended, Nick said with a smirk. 457. Chapter 457. Author note. So it has recently been pointed out to me by a reader that someone has copied and translated this story to Kiddian while slightly altering a few details, probably a translation issue. I am fine with you guys doing this since the story is free on all the platforms I post to, but what I am not fine with is not getting the credit for it. There is no mention of it being a translated work or even a small excerpt in the synopsis, letting people know that I was the one who wrote it, which stings quite a bit, to be honest. Like, I am glad that someone enjoyed the story enough to copy and translate it, but the least they can do was give me credit where I deserve it. It was a strange idea that Nick had out of nowhere, but as he said, would be of great help to him if he could succeed. The idea was simple, really. An enchanted item with the ability to extract souls from a living body and let him use them as raw material or fuel for his creations. Celebrimber was also correct, that if it didn't come out correctly, then it would indeed be a tool of the darkest sort. This wasn't a situation like how Nazgul was created on accident, and thus was neutral in nature despite its original abilities. No, Nick was purposefully trying to create a thing capable of literally tearing out souls, and then allowing him to use them for his own means, which was inherently selfish, and thus leaning towards darkness. If it goes badly, however, the resulting creation will have an insatiable hunger for souls, and be a huge threat that will need to be destroyed. It was a risk, to be sure, but Nick was hopeful that it would work out. Once the metal sheet hardened, Nick went to work measuring and marking it for each of the individual pieces that needed to be made. 3 pieces for each finger and 2 for the thumb, a large piece for the knuckles, and another for the back of the palm. Once they were measured, Nick got to work cutting the pieces out, using a careful application of the severing charm that left him with a slight excess on the pieces, but he could always remove it later, but he couldn't add more. Tossing the pieces into the furnace to heat up again, Nick waited for them to become malleable before removing them, and carefully using his hammer to shape the pieces to fit around his hand, using a transfigured metal version of his hand. Once the pieces were roughly fit, he started to file off the excess metal and sand the sharp edges. After that was done, he put it all back in the furnace to reheat before punching holes through certain locations so he could rivet the pieces together in an articulated fashion. For the rivets, He remelted the excess metal and created thin pins that he flattened on one end before using his hammer to flatten the other after it had passed through the holes he punched previously. The exception to this was the two holes he punched on either side of the bottom of the palm piece that he riveted through a dragon hide glove, completing the form of the item, a gauntlet. Now for the risky part. Nick thought and started to channel his spiritual energy. He used everything about souls as well as his understanding of Nazgul's ability to create this, along with the elvish words Fi, spirit, Mapi, grasp, Wanwa, taken, Ute, use, and calm, creation, to enchant the item with a stern expression. The final result was better than he had hoped, but not exactly as he envisioned. Gauntlet, Unmo Mapi, Underworld's grasp, grade. Mythical abilities, auto-sizing, soul plunder, soul solidification, soul manipulation, ethereal bound. Nick, growth mythical ability, truest self. Grants the one it is bound to an instinctual understanding of a soul's true form. Description, a powerful artifact that grants allows the use of souls in enchantments and creation. System appraisal, a complex artifact with the power to wield the soul as a tool and will carve its name in myth created by an established ring smith. Holy shit! Nick exclaimed with a dumbfounded look as he read the system's appraisal of the thing he created. It was as if his idea had been done in a different way than he had thought it would, not that he was complaining. This was definitely more useful than how he had envisioned it, as knowing the true shape of a soul allowed Nick to not only find the perfect use for them, but also deepen his understanding of them. He had to ponder over why it ended up like this, however, as he couldn't figure it out off the top of his head, and needed a few moments to find the crux of the change. Nick figured out that the reason it turned out like this was because he had carelessly added his knowledge of souls without restraint, including what he learnt from the Daedric book. Daedra were the embodiment of rebirth, and so even that small piece of knowledge that he had was overwhelmingly close to the true understanding of the subject compared to the more mundane knowledge on souls he had. Oh, the things I can do with this, Nick thought with a wide grin as he stared at the ghostly gauntlet on his anvil. 458. Chapter 458. Nick put the gauntlet in his realm before leaving the workshop to go find a few lesser creatures like rats and beetles to use as test subjects. He obviously wasn't going to walk around with something like that in the open, as literally everyone will be able to see it and get curious. The professors would definitely notice that something was wrong with it almost immediately. It would only take a small leap in logic to figure out that he was doing something related to souls, which was an almost taboo subject to study. It wasn't illegal so long as one avoided human experimentation, but that didn't mean it didn't have a heavy aversion attached to it. So rather than deal with that, Nick simply chose to secretively collect a few creatures no one would miss and use their souls as the basis for his experiments. It was one thing that Nick knew already thanks to Nazgul, which was that not all souls were the same. For example, the souls of animals without intelligence, such as rats and beetles, were pure and white, as they cannot do dark arts if they can't know what that is. Intelligent souls, like those of the acromantula, were silver, white, and or some other shade of color based on their innate traits and whether they did dark arts. Acromantula souls, by their man-made monstrous nature, were silver and purple, for example. Nick wasn't going to capture an acromantula quite yet, though, as he wanted to get a real feel for handling the gauntlets first. It wasn't particularly hard to collect a dozen or so rats, since he merely needed to find a warm, semi-isolated spot in the castle and force them out of their burrows. Generations of rats had lived and bred in Hogwarts, so they had in a small way evolved to the climate of the school and thus had habits that he could exploit. Beetles were just as easy to find as the hardy creatures dug under stones into the earth when winter came to stay warm. Nick simply flipped a few rocks and got to collecting. Nobody found it odd that he was doing this either, as so many things called for beetle eyes that shops sold them by the scoopful, a /n. That's an actually canon thing. As for the rats, he captured that too was a regular occurrence for students in the higher years, as they needed test subjects for various magical things. Nick brought the creatures into the realm and slipped on the gauntlet smoothly as it clung to his hand snugly. Let's start with a beetle, he thought as he plucked out one of the small insects with his uncovered left hand. Carefully, he pinched the tips of his fingers on his right hand around the beetle, and to his surprise, the gauntlet sank into the beetle's body like it wasn't there. It stopped once Nick felt a sudden spike of feelings, was the best way to describe it. It was as though he was seeing something without using his eyes in roughly the shape of a beetle in between his fingers without actually seeing it. It was a disorienting experience to say the least, and it was only after he lifted his and then extracted the soul from the beetle that he could actually see the soul. It was a bright white mass of shapeless energy, despite what his new sense was telling him. Checking the beetle, Nick found that the body was still very much alive if motionless, and he wondered if putting the soul back would make it as if nothing had happened. So that was what he did, and as he had thought, the beetle continued doing what it was before he extracted its soul. This was interesting as Nick wondered what would happen if he took out the soul and then killed the body before trying to put the soul back. He thus repeated the test, except this time he used a tiny amount of electricity to stop its body's heart. He waited a few moments before trying to place the soul back into the body, but this time there was a different reaction. The beetle's body twitched horribly for a few minutes before the corpse exploded, and he assumed the soul dissipated. A dead body can't hold a soul, then how do Inferi work? Nick pondered with a frown. Inferi were supposedly created by trapping a soul in its dead body that was then forced to serve the one who killed them. Either this wasn't actually how that worked, or there was something about the process that was different than what he just tried. Noting this disparity, Nick banished the exploded remains of the beetle and grabbed another. 459. Chapter 459. This time Nick took the soul from the body and killed the body before immediately stuffing the soul back into the body, rather than letting the death set in first. Unlike the first time, the beetle didn't twitch or anything after the soul was replaced, and even went about what it was doing previous, until its body lost all energy, and the death state it was in caught up to and dispersed the soul. So a fresh corpse will still function for a while before the dead state of it forces the soul occupying it to disperse. He thought, intrigued. Next he grabbed a rat and redid the previous 3 experiments with similar results, if more dramatic and drawn out, since this soul and body was larger and stronger. Now to see what would happen if I swapped the souls of a rat and a beetle. Nick thought as he retrieved new test subjects. First, he retrieved the beetle's souls, since that was the easiest, and then he took out the rat's soul while leaving the beetle's soul in the living rat body. Immediately, the rat body started to violently change as the fur all fell off, and the skin grew dark and hard, while the rest of the body took on beetle-like properties. Nick didn't waste any time stuffing the rat's soul into the beetle's body as well after seeing this result, and watched as both bodies violently mutated and shifted in size and appearance. After 15 minutes, both bodies looked nothing like their original forms. The rat body was now half the size and had thick, hard carapaced skin, while a third pair of legs had grown out, while the eyes had divided into 2 for a total of 4 eyes on either side of its head. It was a monstrous thing that looked like it fit in the magical world perfectly. The beetle body, on the other, had died from the drastic shift in anatomy that clashed with the pre-existing stuff. Was it because there was not enough biomass for the transformation to finish, or was the soul too different from the body for the changes to finish to begin with? He pondered as he dissected the body to find the anatomy mostly hollow, which he figured was the cause of death. The rat body, on the other hand, was slow-moving, and for lack of a better word, retarded. The beetle's soul is clearly unable to handle the strain of piloting a larger, more complex body. In fact, I believe that this rat body is pushing the limits of its ability to adapt. Nick noted seriously. Nick then grabbed another rat and beetle before extracting the beetle's soul and placing it in the rat's body without removing the rat's soul so he could observe what would happen. The body thrashed and made ungodly sounds for a good 30 minutes before it stabilized and began to mutate like the previous experiment. This time, however, the changes were much less drastic, and the body remained mostly rat-like and even gained some size in addition to its new armored body. And so the rat soul devoured the beetle soul and took on some of the latter's properties, causing the body to change into an overall more powerful creature to match the newly empowered soul. Nick noted, and then had an idea. He then extracted the new soul that was no longer rat or beetle, and then stuffed it in the struggling body of the first experiment. The body also thrashed about violently for some time as the two souls battled to devour the other, and once that was finished, the body began to mutate again. The imperfect rat-beetle fusion that it was previously began to shift into a new, more powerful form that discarded the unneeded traits and added the more advantageous ones. The resulting abomination was a fierce-looking creature the regular size of a rat, with thick black armored skin and streamlined body, with a terrifying-looking head of split jaws like a beetle with a rat's teeth. The more powerful rat soul has grown drastically after devouring the two beetle souls, but is showing signs of instability. Nick noted. Now let's see what happens if I dramatically change the shape of a soul myself without adding a new soul or having the original devour another soul. Nick thought eagerly as he was learning so much from these experiments. For example, he learned that souls could forcefully fuse if trapped in the same body, as well as that the soul in the body heavily determined the shape of it. For this next experiment, Nick hoped to see if he could modify a soul and then put it back into its original body and get a more powerful version of that creature at no extra cost on his part. 460. Chapter 460. The way he intended to do this was a bit special, however, as he wanted to shift the true shape of the soul much like one would edit an image or sentence. Nick wanted to remove the parts that felt redundant and shift that mass to what he saw as improvements. The beetles, for example, lacked magical abilities and were basically at the bottom of the food chain for animals. He wanted to see if it was possible to change that somehow. His first experiment in this regard had him take out the soul of a beetle, and then begin to clumsily, he will admit, manipulate the shape of the soul. First, he removed the middle set of legs, and used that mass to improve the shape and power of the remaining four slightly. Then he began to narrow the beetle's body shape with it coming out like a needle-point arrowhead. He then put this newly modified soul back into the body he took it from originally, and watched as the body began to change shape. The final result was fatter than he made the soul's shape, but the general form of the beetle remained as he designed. Unfortunately, the bug died shortly afterwards from the organs not being designed for this new body type. I wonder if that is true for the other creature as well, but it isn't showing signs of it because the failures are taking longer to manifest. Nick pondered while looking at the rat-beetle hybrid abomination. The creature didn't seem to be in pain or suffering, and was even wandering about in the isolated area it was in a bored manner. Nick cast a medical spell he learned from Slytherin's library that allowed one to gaze into the internal workings of a body without harming the one it was cast on. It was merely one of the many high-end specialized spells that Nick had learned from absorbing the man's life's worth of knowledge. Slytherin didn't do it by half when writing down his life in the library, and it was almost as if he was personally teaching Nick all that he knew. Mana-wise, Nick was weaker than Snape and most of the professors, but in terms of knowledge, he likely only fell short of Dumbledore in the school. That was after only completing half of Slytherin's library to boot. Nick wasn't sure whether or not Dumbledore had more or less knowledge on magic than Slytherin. What he did know was that after he finished absorbing the contents of the library, he would definitely have the knowledge of a powerful Tier 4 wizard at the least. Anyways, the spell allowed Nick to see that not only was the abomination's organs not slowly failing, they even seemed to be improved instead. What is the difference between the two transformations? Both are clearly unnatural, but one caused the death of the test subject, while the other only made it stronger. Nick pondered seriously. It was a fascinating difference that fueled his curiosity in the subject of souls even further, as it was such a complex and wide topic. Even in the first half of Slytherin's library, Nick had seen only 3 mentions on the topic, and those were merely uses of it the founder had personally seen. Sadly, the medical magics that were in the first half of the library focused exclusively on the mind, and body such as curses, poisons, and mental wounds. Even in the library of Hogwarts, there was a tiny amount of books on souls, and all of them minus 2 were books on dark magic. After pondering it for a moment, Nick developed a theory on why the two different approaches to the same result had different results in the end. Basically, all souls knew what they, and by extension, the body was supposed to be like, and acted on the body to manifest this. By forcefully altering the shape and function of the soul, Nick had introduced imperfections in this knowledge that translated to the body not being able to cope with it, as some parts didn't know they needed to change as well. In the case where one soul devoured the other, however, the entirety of the soul was overhauled and improved, thus meaning there were no imperfections in the design of the knowledge. Nick could only frown at this, though, since if true it meant that to manually alter a soul he needed to either change, literally, every facet of the soul's form himself, which was way more effort than it was worth in the case of simple bugs or rats, or he needed to limit the changes to the soul to less fundamental things like small upgrades to the legs. 461. Chapter 461. Nick decided to put any further experiments in that particular regard in his long list of things to do later, before moving on to his next, and admittedly highly illegal experiment, trying to turn the mundane magical. One of the 3 pillars of magic was the soul, so Nick was curious if it was possible to add magic to a mundane creature's soul, and then put the soul back into the creature in order to induce a magic-centric mutation in the creature in question. If it worked, then it meant that it may even work on muggles. He doubted it was enough to genuinely create a wizard from a muggle, since they would lack a magical core and circuits, but it might be enough to possibly allow that muggles' offspring to develop them instead. If it worked out, then Nick imagined that it would only take him 4 or 5 generations to transform most of the human race into wizards. Just thinking of all the muggle geniuses that could have revolutionized the wizarding world, by this point, if that had been the case 1,000 years back, was enough to make Nick shudder. The method Nick chose to introduce magic to the soul was a simple one, but at the same time dangerous. He summoned a small jar of frost salts from elsewhere in the realm and grabbed a beetle from his dwindling stock, as well as a single grain of frost salt. Using his gauntleted hand to extract the soul of the beetle, Nick used his opposite hand to carefully drop the frost salt grain into the center of the soul. Immediately, the soul started to turn blue and grow in size in his grasp before bursting like an overfilled balloon. The soul showed clear signs of integrations, so why did it explode? Was it too weak to handle it, perhaps? He wondered curiously before drawing out the soul of the abomination and repeating the experiment, since this time the soul was far stronger than before. Once again, the soul immediately started to turn blue after the grain of frost salt was added to it. And once again, the soul began to swell, only this time it stopped at double its original size and stabilized. Nick frowned, however, when he noticed that a vast majority of the soul remained white, which was the normal color compared to the blue of the magic. He didn't want to risk destroying the soul, though, and didn't try to add more frost salt to it, and instead pushed the soul into the body and waited to see if it would manifest magic. The body came to life after the soul was placed into it, but quickly started to shiver and shake as it breathed out cold mist. Soon enough, the creature died, however, and after dissecting it, he could only declare this experiment a total failure. The soul caused magic to appear in the body, all right, but the problem was that the cold magic had nowhere to actually go, since the body wasn't made for it, and so ended up freezing to death from the inside out. While a strong enough soul can indeed gain magical properties, the body will end up damaged from the rampant magic it produced inside it. Nick thought with a sigh, and finally called it there for these types of experiments, and moved on to adding the souls to his enchanted items, which was his original purpose for creating the gauntlet. Doing so caused the souls to be broken down into a sort of pure energy, however, rather than giving the enchantments living properties. The size and quality of the soul also determined how much benefit the enchantment gained from it. Using the rings of protection as a base, Nick determined that a normal rat soul was worth 4 beetle souls, but less than a Goliath beetle soul. This didn't reference the actual species of beetles, known as Goliath beetles, but rather the soul that came about by feeding one beetle soul 3 others. The final resulting soul was far more powerful than the sum of its parts, and interestingly enough, didn't cause almost any changes in the normal beetle body. It was instead doubling it in size. Nick did the same for rat souls to create a Goliath rat soul, and found that such a soul was massively more powerful than the sum of its parts. Is it possible that this is what that monster created from the ritual experienced? If so, then it explains why it can use magic like it is a limb, since its soul is extremely powerful. Nick thought, with a bit of horror, as if it was true the thing's soul was likely Tier 5, or guards, forbid Tier 6 in power. 462. Chapter 462. After concluding his experiments with the gauntlet, Nick got rid of all the leftovers, while feeding the souls of the still living creatures to a single rat, before extracting the now very powerful soul, and using it to empower the anklet he wears on his leg. Nick hadn't forgotten this particular piece of protective gear, but refused to use it unless it was an emergency, since the longer he went without doing so, the more powerful it got. As it was at the moment, using it would make it seem as though time had stopped for Nick for all of about a minute. That was what a total loss of kinetic energy within 20 feet would look like if one was indoors after all. After the empowerment by the soul, however, the range grew to nearly 60 feet in every direction. Having the realm break down and assimilate the corpse's base components, Nick stored the gauntlet away and left the realm. With a flick of his wand, he knew the current time and started to head towards the great hall since it was dinner time. Nick listened in on the conversations as he walked to his regular seat at the Gryffindor long table. Seems the ministry is keeping the news on the creature under wraps for now, no doubt to take credit for it after we deal with it, he thought with derisively. The more his knowledge and power grew, the more Nick started to disdain the petty methods that Fudge and the ministry used to keep the British wizarding community reliant on them. He understood why they did it, of course, but that didn't mean he didn't find it pathetic. As much as everyone tries to ignore it, the fact of the matter was tricks only counted for so far, and only having true recognized power really held weight. It was why Dumbledore, Grindelwald, and even Voldemort were all able to sway the hearts and minds of so many people. Each and every last one of them showed their power and ambitions, and people naturally fell in line behind them to follow those same ambitions. Simply having an ambition but no power behind it was unsustainable, and it showed as the ministry was constantly scrambling to keep hold of its place at the head of the wizards, but it was a tenuous affair. Shaking his head to remove such thoughts, Nick sat down at the table next to Harry. "Hey, did you hear? The next match has been decided already," Ron said excitedly between messy mouthfuls of food. "Oh, which ones is it this time?" Nick asked curiously. "It's the Mermen and the Krakens. The captains of the teams put out the announcement earlier when you were doing whatever it is that you do by yourself," Ron said seriously. "When's it scheduled?" Nick asked with interest. "This coming up Saturday, supposed to be better than the last game since they've had longer to train," Harry said with a shrug. "It might be, but it's not a very complicated sport, so there's not a whole lot to improve upon," Nick said honestly. "That is where you are wrong, my reclusive friend," Fred chimes in from further down the table. "The rules aren't very complicated to understand, true, but the things that we players can do is much broader and intricate. We had affectionately called them BTs, or Blitz techniques, if you don't like the short version. Can't really go into details, since we don't want to ruin the surprise, but it's gonna change the whole game," George says with a wide grin. "Pretty sure I know what you are referring to, but I'll see for myself this upcoming Saturday," Nick said with a shrug. The week moved by quickly after that as Nick focused on trying to complete his mission as quickly as possible, as he was starting to get close to the 250,000 rings of protection needed for it. He also recovered a hefty amount of points as a result, and was eyeing the book on magical cloaking he saw previously, since he was still very much interested in it. The day of the match, Nick woke up as per normal and took on his Animagus form, before vanishing from the dorm after he got dressed. Nick had discovered that after he gained the celestial bird form, he got a slight improvement to his natural vision and related bloodline abilities, but could only gain all the benefits of the species if he was in the form. This meant no elemental teleportation unless he took on his Animagus form. A little inconvenient to be sure, but nothing he couldn't work around by getting a little privacy. 463. Chapter 463. It was funny how no one seemed to question the strange new magical creature that flew around the castle in the morning every day, or how Nick seemed to suddenly be able to teleport when he was out of sight. The only ones actually aware of the situation was the staff of the school, and they had been keeping it quiet just like with Lupin's new state. Nick had been very pleased with his Animagus form, all things considered, as it felt natural to him, and even gave him a few new abilities while in it. The deal with Fudge and the Ministry regarding Blitz Ball was also starting to create a heavy inflow of money into his account at Gringotts from all the international deals that went through, and money being spent on the sport globally. It was sporadic at first, but as things went into full swing globally, with promotions, merchandise and construction cost for the fields all started to steadily flow a stupid amount of money into his account. Nick only made about 2 nuts per galleon, but when that was applied at a global scale, he was making hundreds of galleons every single day at this point. Nick was nowhere near the most rich person in the country, but in about 3 years, he predicted he would be at least close to having that amount of money. The only real stress that Nick had at the moment was the ever-approaching arrival of Zeus, and this new magic-eating abomination in the form of Bellatrix Lestrange, at peak health and beauty. Oh yes, the ritual fully restored her body to its most perfect state, which in addition to the fact she was actually very attractive, naturally meant the creature was much like the vibrantly colored animals in the wild, pretty to look at, but lethal to mess with. Still, Nick wasn't all that interested in such things despite his own teenage body starting to cause him problems in that regard. While everyone else in his year was also hitting growth spurts and taking interest in the opposite sex, he had to deal with additional issues. For example, the fact that 4 out of 6 of his friends were female, and his sensitive elven senses bluntly told him when they started their cycles. It was distracting to say the least for him to constantly have to ignore his biological instincts in this regard. He flew for an hour or so, until it was time to head over to the Blitzball field for the game that was set right after breakfast. He made sure no one was around before changing back to his normal form and finding a seat in the bleachers. While he waited, Nick waved his wand and caused the ice and snow on the seats to evaporate before the other students started to arrive. "When you get here?" Anthony Goldstein asked in confusion after being the second person to get to the bleachers. "A few minutes ago, even had time to clear off the frost from the rest of the seats while I waited," Nick said casually. Anthony looked around at that and found that indeed the seats were in fact totally clear of all snow and ice. "My in-law said I shouldn't compare myself to you, but you are really making the rest of us look bad with stuff like this," Anthony complained. "Oh, who's your in-law?" Nick asked curiously. "You don't know?" I figured he would have mentioned it, but then again he does get sort of focused when he is talking about magical beast, Anthony muttered. He shook his head. "Newt Scamander is my great-uncle-in-law through marriage. Married my grand's cousin, in fact," Anthony said proudly. "Ah, so you are related to Newt then. Afraid he really never mentioned it during conversation," Nick said, understanding the situation. Anthony was distantly related to Newt, and probably had Newt tell him not to make comparisons during a family reunion of some sort. "It's fine, I suppose, since I told him we weren't friends or anything like that," Anthony said with a shrug. "Don't really have much reason to have been friends with the schedule that we had in the first year and all the stuff I had to deal with at the time. Hell, I probably wouldn't even be friends with Luna if she wasn't as unique as she is," Nick said honestly. Anthony chuckled. "Yeah, that girl is something all right. Did you know there's a bet going around about whether or not she is special like you or genuinely loony?" Anthony asked, and Nick shook his head. "Sounds like the sort of thing a bunch of gossipy girls would do," he says with a scoff. 464. Chapter 464. Anthony laughed at that. "That describes them perfectly," he said in agreement. "Let me guess it was probably started by whoever it was that wanted to bully Luna, right?" Nick asked with a knowing look. "Nailed it in one. I admit the rest of us should have probably put a stop to it, but didn't want to clash with the ones responsible," Anthony said with clear shame. I would have put a stop to it myself if Luna hadn't, so it doesn't matter, Nick said honestly. He meant it too, as if Luna hadn't put a stop to her mistreatment by her housemates, he would have made everyone involved miserable. Anthony went silent at that, as he had heard of the way Nick had dealt with those that displeased him, and it sounded like an all-around bad time. He had never truly harmed any of them, but each time he acted, he left those unlucky few scared and cautious of getting on his bad side again. It was at this point that more students started to arrive, and Anthony used this to end the conversation. Nick knew about it, of course, but simply couldn't bring himself to care and waited for the game to start officially. Soon enough, water started to rise from the Black Lake and fill the field while more and more people filled the seats. There were a few reporters, and even surprisingly enough talent scouts who did a poor job hiding that fact. Still, the bleachers weren't nearly as full as they were during the first game, which made sense as foreign wizards with too much time hadn't traveled to the Isles to see it this time. Still, it's good to see the sport has so many interested, since it will boost my reputation greatly with the wizards that don't care for magical prowess. Nick thought with a small smile. It certainly helped that Nick was also profiting from the creation of the sport greatly, and would likely continue to do so until he was richer than the church. Soon enough, it was time for the game to begin, and like with the Quidditch matches, Lee Jordan was the announcer for it. The first team to enter the field was the mermen who wore pale blue body suits with green seaweed-looking wraps around their wrists and ankles. Oh, it seems the designer for this outfit read my research paper on the merfolk in the lake. Nick thought, surprised. It was a rather niche topic after all, so it was not the sort of thing that one would usually search out. Compared to the other books on the underwater people in the library, Nick's research report was the only one that took a neutral stance on the topic, and only gave the facts as they were without any conjectures or theories. He didn't include the seal on their bloodlines, though since that would draw the wrong sort of ideas from the readers. To be honest, however, Nick hadn't expected anyone to really read his research, and even less to use the information within to design our outfit. An interesting thing Nick noticed about the outfits was that the hands and feet were webbed and finned respectively, which would give an edge to the team's movement ability in the water. There was no rule against this sort of outfit modification, so until something about it was added, it was totally legal. The Krakens entered the field after that, and they also wore body suits designed after the creature in question. The outfits were white with tentacles designs on the arms and legs, but interesting was the actual suction cups on the hands of the suits. That would help keeping a hold on the ball, but would also make it harder to pass it as well, an interesting trade-off. Nick thought, intrigued by it. To his amusement, the person serving as the referee, which in this case was Tracy, was wearing a replica of his own silver body suite with a black badge on the front and back. I guess that will be the standard referee outfit for the sport from now on, Nick thought with a smirk. The game started, and Nick got to see the effects of the outfit modifications in action. Like he thought the mermen's outfits granted them superior speed all around compared to the Krakens who struggled to keep up. It wasn't so great that extra effort couldn't fill the gap, but still quite noticeable. The suction cups on the Kraken's outfits, on the other hand, also did what Nick had expected, which neutralized the extra momentum behind the mermen's tackles when they had the ball. All in all, the game was actually very close in terms of outfit functionality, as both sides had an advantage in one way or another. 465. Chapter 465. Despite this, it was only halfway through the first quarter of the game that Nick saw what the twins were bragging about. When the right attacker for the Krakens was making it within scoring distance of the merman's goal, the twins moved to tackle. Except when the Kraken went to break through the twins, they both grinned and did something awesome. One of them flipped onto their back with their arms open to anchor themselves in place, while the other placed their feet on the bottom of their brother's feet. Both then crouched and then sprang to full length in perfect synchrony, launching one of them at very fast speeds into the Kraken. Nick was impressed, since while it was theoretically possible, it required perfect timing between both parties, or the forces would clash rather than blend. This maneuver was dubbed the Weasley Bolt by Lee Jordan, and Nick had to agree that it fit. It was clearly thought up by the twins to take advantage of their own synchronicity with each other. For anyone not so in sync with their partner, this technique would take a large amount of effort to learn, much less use in a match. The crowd went nuts when the twins did this, as not only was it awesome, but it even paid off as the Kraken lost the ball as the twin tore it from the suction-cupped hand holding it. This technique use seemed to prompt an all-out reveal of different techniques between the two teams. From the Krakens, there was a tackle dodge that involved spinning in place, a scoring technique that involved adding a spin to the ball so that the goalie had trouble catching it. From the Merman, Nick saw a suspiciously high amount of special tackles from the twins and one goalie technique, involving the goalie kicking the ball to one of their teammates instead of catching it. Nick had to admit that the twins' bragging wasn't for nothing, as this game would almost certainly create a precedent for special techniques in any future games. The game, like the first one, ended after only 2 quarters, with the scores being fairly close to each other. The Krakens had 7 points, while the Mermen had 6. The Weasley bolt, as it turned out, was a costly technique, as it placed a great deal of stress on the leg muscles from the full exertion of strength used. As a result, the twins had trouble walking after they needed to walk once the game ended, since they used it another 2 times during the game. "So what did you think? Pretty awesome, right?" Fred asked after finding Nick once he finished changing in the locker room. "I admit all that bragging might have something to it, but don't go getting a big head about it," Nick said with a shrug. "Ha, we knew you'd be impressed," George said with a pleased smile. "Musculus, Sana," Nick said while pointing at the twins' legs. A warm orange glowing mist flowed from the tip of his wand and washed over them, causing them to sigh in relief as the pain in their bodies melted away somewhat. "Now that's some good stuff," they exclaimed at the same time. "I merely repaired the damage to your muscles at a surface level so that you both stopped limping so much. It was distracting," Nick said honestly. Slytherin was thorough in his research and experiments, if nothing else, and thus had a fix for all manner of injuries, including overexertion like what the twins were experiencing. "Medispells, Nick, branching out, are we?" Fred asked with a grin. "Not that we're complaining, mind you, just surprised to see it is all," George said honestly. "Knowledge is power, and you never know when it might come in handy. Besides, those potions that Madame Pomfrey gives taste terrible anyways." Nick joked, and the twins shuddered and nodded. "On that we can agree," they said at the same time. The twins had a bad habit of getting injured or hexed in some manner due to their experiments in making prank items that as a result landed them in Madame Pomfrey's care. The woman had her own form of punishment for unnecessary injuries, in the form of all of the potions she received from Snape being modified to have unpleasant tastes. It was a simple matter to do it, and the potion master got amusement out of it to a degree as well. He even went so far as to make special variants of the potions for the twins that were worse than usual. To be fair, though, the twins regularly make nuisances of themselves, and getting on his nerves with the similarity to the marauders they had. 466. Chapter 466. Time passed by again after that as 2 weeks came, and went with a few things happening during that time. The first was that there were 3 more matches between the 4 Blitz Ball teams in Hogwarts, with the Krakens currently being undefeated. This had made an interesting dynamic, in which the members of the different Hogwarts houses had mutual fandom for the same Hogwarts teams. Dumbledore was in a great mood as a result, since the interactions between houses lightened up considerably. Nick didn't have a favorite team or anything, but made time to watch any games being held to relax. The second thing was that Nick had conducted the rituals he had found in Slytherin's library to improve his power base. The ritual of expansion reduced the size of Nick's magical core, but made it produce denser and higher quality mana, despite putting him back at the start of the 3rd tier again. The ritual of clarity, on the other hand, expanded his magical circuits and strengthened them so he could use even more powerful magic without straining them from the sheer quantity of mana in them. So despite getting sent back to the start of Tier 3, Nick was more powerful than ever now. There was a slight problem that he hadn't accounted for when doing these rituals that almost exposed his elven nature. After the ritual of clarity was completed, Nick's presence grew greatly, and even while he was restraining it, with the item he had made previously for that a small amount leaked out, earning him confused looks from those that got within a certain distance of him. He was forced to destroy the previous item and create a new, more powerful version that got it under control, while he passed it off as the side effect of an experiment before. The third thing was that he had gotten far enough into the Daedric book to start binding his essence to the realm. He didn't, however, because being able to start the process didn't mean he should start the process. Nick was cautious enough to know better than to be hasty in making this decision, as one wrong move, and he ceases to exist. Still, he was excited at finally reaching the starting point for this in terms of knowledge. Once he successfully became a realm lord, he could start thinking about the next logical step after that, reaching for divinity. After all, Nick assumed that by the time he completed the process of becoming a realm lord, he will already be tier 4, or depending on Grindelwald, tier 5. The final thing Nick did was hand out all the Christmas gifts he needed to for his friends, early, since he didn't intend to spend very long on the holiday. The gifts weren't very inspired or extravagant like his usual ones, but served his purpose and freed him from any obligations involving the holiday. Beyond these things, Nick mostly focused on honing his use of the celestial bird's abilities when he was transformed. Weather manipulation was still a huge mana hog of an ability, but at least while he was transformed, it came more naturally to him. Elemental teleportation was by far his favorite, however, as unlike apparition, there was no distance limit he needed to overcome. Thanks to this fact, he had been able to teleport all the way to France in a single go. Beauxbatons, specifically as he appeared in an awkward fashion on the school grounds during a flying lesson, ironically enough. There was a rather large commotion as the students and teacher of the class retaliated in alarm, thinking he meant them harm. In truth, Nick had merely chosen that spot because it was where he was during the pageant and had forgotten to take the other uses for it the school may have had. He flew away from the school while under heavy attack by a bunch of first years and a teacher, but he at least learned where the school was located now. Much like Hogwarts, the French school was also located in the countryside, far from any large Muggle establishments. The closest thing to the school, unlike Hogwarts, however, was a winery and vineyard that was covered in snow at the moment. Nick memorized his location in the sky before vanishing in a burst of electricity as he returned to Hogwarts. Meanwhile, back at Beauxbatons, Madame Maxime was speaking with the teacher for the flying class about his appearance. Once he had left, and things had begun to calm down, the teacher had started to notice things that they had overlooked in the heat of the moment. One such thing was that he looked as surprised to see them as they were to see him, which Madame Maxime thought pointed to an accidental teleportation on his part, since there are reports of young phoenixes doing so as well. 467. Chapter 467. The problem she had, however, was that whatever it was that had shown up at her school was definitely not a phoenix. The details of its appearance was all wrong, and the element it used to arrive was also wrong. At the same time, it was also not a thunderbird either, as the colors were all off, and it had a few phoenix-like traits. Despite her great knowledge of magical beasts, she simply had no clue what the creature that had shown up was. Perhaps Newt would know. She pondered after ensuring the creature hadn't done any harm. Nick didn't realize that he had indirectly sent Newt on a wild goose chase, as the magizoologist would go searching for the unknown bird that had appeared in Beauxbatons, but would not be able to find it for a long time for obvious reasons. Even if he did know, however, he still wouldn't feel bad, as for someone like Newt, magical beast were his life, and the thrill of the hunt to find them was its own reward. Nick had returned to Hogwarts in a good mood, all things considered, as he had learned that not only was distance not an object for him, he could also reach anywhere in the world in an instant after having visited it at least once. Nick walked out of the workshop and was surprised to find Luna at the door with a basket of fruit. "Where did you even find fruit at this time of year?" he asked, confused at the sight. Luna tilted her head. Professor Sprout has an enchanted garden of fruit and vegetables in one of the disused greenhouses. She let me pick a basket when I asked. She said like that was common knowledge. I don't get along very well with magical plants, so I try to avoid the greenhouses as much as possible, Nick said with an awkward chuckle. Luna smiled. I know. I was coming to bring you some food, since you haven't been going to lunch very much this year," she said while holding up the basket. "I think I have a better idea. Come in and take a seat," Nick said with a smile as he stepped aside. Luna found her normal spot in the workshop and took a seat while placing the basket of food on the small table nearby. "Darty," Nick called, and the house elf appeared with a bow. "Bring me 2 cinnamon sticks, a tea kettle, and 2 teacups," Nick said, and the elf vanished with a loud pop. Luna tilted her head in confusion at the order as she couldn't understand what he was going to do. Nick merely smiled and went over to the basket of produce and took out a couple sand pears, apples, and lemons from it and tapped them with his wand. Immediately the fruits peeled and sliced themselves neatly before landing on the table. "It's clean." Soon, Darty returned with what Nick asked for and left after getting thanked. Nick roasted the cinnamon sticks from a few moments with his flames to help release the flavor before tossing them into the kettle alongside the fruits and their juices. Nan. Luna watched in interest as he did all this, as she was starting to figure it out, but hadn't even considered such a thing before. Once the kettle was full, Nick held it by the handle and rested his other hand underneath it, where he created a flame to heat the mixture within. Soon, a sweet and fragrant smell filled the air of the workshop as the water came to a boil within the kettle. The kettle started whistling to release the steam, and Nick stopped applying heat to it and set it down on a stone kettle coaster that was there on the table. He then tapped the tip of his wand against the side of the kettle, and sloshing sounds came from it. Once he was satisfied, he stopped and poured the mixture inside into the 2 teacups. It was an amber-colored liquid with little pieces of fruit in it that smelled sweet and warm. "Give it a try," Nick said with a smile, and Luna gently picked up the cup and blew on the contents that were still quite hot before taking a sip. She smiled brightly. "It's quite lovely, thank you," she said, and blew on the liquid again. "It's a genuine fruit tea, not at all like those strange drinks that mix actual tea with fruit. It's a personal favorite of mine I discovered during the summer break between my first year and second," Nick says honestly. "Why not make it more often?" Luna asked curiously. 468. Chapter 468. Nick shook his head. This is not the sort of thing to be made often, but rather on occasions when one feels like treating themselves. This way you don't lose appreciation for it, he said honestly. Too much of a good thing spoils it, Luna said with an understanding nod. Now then, let's see what else we have in this basket to eat, shall we? Nick said, and began to look through the basket. He found cucumbers, tomatoes, carrots, and cabbage within it other than the leftover fruit. Looks like it's salad then, he said with a shrug. They ate and drank in relative silence before Luna took the leftover produce in the basket and left skipping. It was a warm and peaceful moment for Nick between his various different projects that he was working on. A good example would be the Ring of Protection mission he was on the precipice of completing the main part of, and he only had one more part that he planned to do before turning the mission in. The next part was to create an entire set of armor that was rare grade at minimum. The thing here was that since each part of the armor wouldn't be directly connected, they would all need to be rare grade to qualify. Assuming that he chose the gauntlet as the first piece, he was well on his way to that goal. Nick wasn't going to do that, though, since if he was going to make an armor, he at least wanted it to be publicly usable. The gauntlet was a borderline taboo artifact with its functions, so he won't be exposing it so flippantly. Instead, he needed to make an entirely new set of armor from scratch. He had thought about just making it using the Twilight style, but chose to handcraft each piece since he felt like it was almost cheating otherwise. I'll do that during the break that starts in a day, Nick thought as cleaned up the mess in the workshop from the meal. After that, he left the workshop to go and hang out with his friends while all of them were in the school. It wasn't particularly difficult to find them, as they were all in the courtyard playing in the snow. "So what will all of you be doing for the holidays?" Nick asked after nailing Harry with a snowball. "Sirius is hosting a Christmas party. You are invited, by the way," Harry said, returning fire. "Tracy and I will be attending a few political parties, like always, before relaxing at home," Daphne said as she too launched a snowball at Nick. He was a slippery target, though, and dodged both attacks while preparing his own. "I'll probably go to Sirius's party and stay at Hogwarts otherwise," Ron shouted while teaming up with everyone else against Nick. Hermione and Luna didn't participate, but said that they were going to be spending the holidays at home. 4 against 1, huh? I like those odds. Nick called with a laugh as he drew his wand and went rapid fire on them. This caused the snowball fight to escalate until it became a full-on snowball war, with anyone unlucky enough to be near getting dragged into it. Most of Gryffindor and some of Hufflepuff ended up split into 2 sides that hurled snowballs through the air in a gloriously over-the-top amount of powdered ice. It was only after McGonagall interceded that the war ended, but both sides had casualties. The twins were a favorite target and had a bunch of bruises alongside several other people. Nick only got hit a few times thanks to his inhuman reflexes, and that was mostly just because it's a bit hard to dodge a wall of snowballs aimed at you. Sure, he could have used a shield spell to block them, but that sort of removed the fun from a snowball fight. All in all, it was a good time to be had, and a fun way to spend the remaining time they had together before everyone left for wherever they went for the holiday break. Like that, Christmas break started early the next day, and all the students leaving boarded the train and set off. Like every year, the castle felt empty, without all the students it normally held, and all but a few noticed it. Nick wasn't amongst that number as he was in the workshop planning out how he wanted to do his armor. What about this? Nick, though, as he transfigured a block of stone into a set of armor. The shoulders are too wide and will get in your way when you swing your arms. Celebrimba said casually. 469. Chapter 469. Nick had been going through various ideas with Celebrimba in regards to the design of his armor, since the ancient elf was a renowned smith before he ever forged a single ring. This meant that while Nick had the knowledge he would need to make an armor, he lacked the experience in armor making that Celebrimba had. Thanks to this, he didn't make the common mistake of creating a suit of armor that had flaws. If the armor wasn't for a specific person, then it didn't need to be made with certain facets in mind, like the shape of the wearer's body. In this case, however, Nick was making the armor for himself, and thus needed to keep his own proportions in mind with his design. Using Celebrimba's help, he had already removed most of the flaws in the armor that came from his design changes, and it was now a game of minimizing them. It is impossible to create a truly perfect armor at this time since he was still growing, and his proportions may change as well. This looks about as good as it will get, Nick thought after he changed the design again. It will serve for the moment, but never settle for less than your best after your body finishes changing. Celebrimba said seriously. Wasn't planning on it, old man. Nick thought with a chuckle. What are you going to enchant each piece to do, and where will you start? The elf asked, ignoring the jab at his age. I will start with the greaves, and I was thinking maybe using a gravity enchantment to make the suit lighter on me so I can move faster. Nick thought seriously. Why not a spatial expansion enchantment so that each step you take counts as 2? The elf suggested. Why don't I mix both then? Nick thought, and Celebrimba agreed that would be the best option. Greaves, for those not in the know, is a form of heavy metal armor for the part of the legs below the knees that typically ended with armor over the feet that is called sabatons. Nick first chose the metal for the armor, which in this case was an alloy of adamantium and goblin silver to give it equal parts sturdiness and magical conductivity. Next, he created molds for each piece of the armor so that he had a rough shape to work with that would save him a little time shaping the metal. Next, he created the alloy and channeled it into the mold for the greaves before waiting for the metal to solidify. Once it did, he used an exact replica of his leg to hammer out the inconsistencies and true shape of the greaves. All that was left at that point was to buff out any dents and to polish it up. Nick then repeated this process for all the rest of the armor pieces, which included the cuisses, thighs, folds, waist, cuirass, chest, pauldrons, shoulders, rerebrace, upper arm, vambrace, forearm, gauntlets, hands, and finally the helmet. The full set of armor was made of 9 different pieces that he personally adjusted to his body and polished to a high shine. The armor was sleek and flowing with clear feather patterns from the top to the bottom of it. It was also a strange bluish color that the alloy had for some reason, not that Nick cared all that much. Now to enchant each piece and tie them all together. Nick thought seriously as he placed the greaves on his anvil. Nick chose 4 words to go along with his understanding, and will for this enchantment, JL men, space, gravitime, gravity, Andy, length and ranter, part. These words will help channel his will and knowledge more precisely as he strikes the metal with his anvil. The final result was pretty much exactly what he had planned on making, as once the rest of the armor was tied together, it will get a decrease in weight, thanks to this enchantment. The same was true of the space expansion, part of the enchantment that made each of his steps like 2 instead of the normal one. In truth, he could have made that figure higher, but doing so ran the risk of getting disoriented every time he moved. At the current level, however, the shift in location was small enough to be mostly ignored, thus granting him basically doubled speed. As a bonus, the greaves were peak rare grade, which showed that they were as close to mythical grade as he could get without crossing that line. This is a good base to build off of that, will allow you to make this armor even better than normal, Celebrimber said proudly. 470. Chapter 470. Next up is the quizzes, which I think I will add a simple balance enchantment to. Nick thought, while setting the greaves to the side. After he mastered the Celebrimber style and gained near-perfect control of his spiritual energy, he became much more efficient at crafting new items. Add on to this his current reserves of mana, and he can now craft 2 brand new enchantments back-to-back before needing to refill his mana. He didn't need any tricks or cut corners in order to do this either, as he was easily considered a master smith by elven standards. Still, 2 enchantments back-to-back was the absolute limit of his energy reserves, so he waited a bit to regain some more mana. Not long, just 30 minutes or so, before he started to enchant the quizzes as well. For them, he used the 3 words, ranter, part, lunther, balance, and steadime, steady. With them, he tied the enchantment for the greaves to the quizzes, and created the balance enchantment that would make him quite hard to knock over while he wore the armor. The grade of this piece of the armor, while still rare, was only mid-rare at best, but Nick had expected this considering how simple the effect it had was. Nick was pleased about this, as if the rest of the armor was also rare grade, then by default, the whole set will be counted as such as well. He relaxed as he waited for his mana to refill by sitting in his chair and working on the Daedric book he had. Nick was eager to fully absorb the information held within the book and start the process of becoming a true realm lord. The problem was that the book contained extremely high-end information that made it a pain to understand. In truth, Nick had a suspicion that he was having so much difficulty with it because it might be a higher tier of power's level of information. In that case, it made perfect sense, as he was simply trying to skip a grade or 2 in terms of pure information without having the required background information to begin with. It was like a normal second-year student trying to learn a 6th-year subject. Was it possible? Yes, it was. Was it easy? Nope. In fact, it was extremely difficult, as that student would need to constantly fight with the subject because of lacking the context for parts of it. Nick knew this, of course, but he was helpless about it, as even Tier 4 knowledge was very hard to come by, not to even think about Tier 5 or 6. Slytherin's library was able to provide Tier 4 information, and maybe a small amount of Tier 5 if Slytherin recorded anything after he basically turned himself into a lick. This gave Nick a leg up over most people, but compared to the likes of Zeus, it was simply not even worth mentioning. This was what made becoming a realm lord so important to Nick. With that done, even Zeus would be nearly helpless to truly kill him, and that let Nick get the breathing room he would need to try and close the gap. Anyways, he made very little progress in this regard over the next 4 hours, as his mana refilled itself passively with every breath he took. That was the only real downside to having greater amounts of mana that was of a higher quality that Nick found. It takes longer and longer for him to recover after emptying his reserves as he grew more powerful. Nick thought it was a worthy trade-off, really, since it only made sense for it to happen. Perhaps that's why the higher-tiered being can't sustain themselves in this less mana-dense environment. Their natural consumption and replenishment of mana simply can't handle the small amount of mana, thus making them die slowly and painfully as their bodies drain other forms of energy to fill the mana need. Nick pondered curiously. This also explained why the golden apple tree in the vault had survived long enough for Rowena Ravenclaw to find and store it in a stasis field. Magical plants were much less complicated than people, and thus didn't need as much mana to survive. It's possible that the tree was just barely hanging on thanks to this fact, and if it hadn't been found by my ancestor, would probably be dead by now. Nick thought thankful about it, since that tree likely held the key to the higher tiers, and he could tell it would be a pain to reach them on his own effort. 471. Chapter 471. At the end of his recovery time, Nick put away the book and cleared his mind of his distracting thoughts. He then grabbed the folds and set them on the anvil, not quite sure about this one actually. Any ideas? Nick thought to see if Celebrimber had any ideas. Nick roughly knew what most of the pieces were going to be enchanted to do, but the folds happened to be one of them that he was not quite sure about. The others were the pauldrons and the rerebrace that he also wasn't sure about. Perhaps a flight mechanic of some sort, so you don't need to transform in order to fly. The old elf offered, and Nick thought about it for a moment before nodding. As much as it killed him to admit, Nick knew that his Animagus form was not ideal for combat and was far more useful for retreating and stalling instead. It simply had no way to cast real spells in any manner that Nick could learn quickly, as it lacked the vocal cords needed to speak incantations, as well as any sort of decent aim, while holding his wand in its talons. Wandless silent casting might be a thing, but even people like Dumbledore can barely do it, and the magic is pitifully weak. When they do so, Nick saw no purpose to learning it at the moment. Thanks to his Animagus form, however, and the books on flight magic he had already read, Nick knew exactly how to enchant the folds for flight. He channeled this knowledge and his intent into his hammer and branded the folds with 4 words: Ranta, part, JNCE, bird, vile, fly, and Gwelu, air. In a manner of speaking, Nick was actually creating a sort of runic armor that there was a scant few examples of remaining. This wasn't referring to plain enchanted armor, but rather the few times in history when each individual piece of an armor set was enchanted to be a part of a whole. The reason there are very few examples left in the world was because pieces got destroyed, and thus the entire set was imperfect and incomplete despite what anyone may do to rectify this. Runic armor was also horribly difficult to make, so there was few times that it was created, and each of them was under the insistence of a rich or famous individual. Nick was sort of cheating in this regard, as he was using the word Ranta in order to forcefully tie the pieces and their enchantments together. In the normal creation of a runic armor, the entire thing needed to be inscribed with runes at the same time, continuously from one part to the next, without stopping to rest or recover. While this was possible, only those enchanters with long years of experience and grand amounts of mana ever succeeded in it. To a degree, it is considered a lost art, as so few ever succeeded at it, and passed on their knowledge to the next generation as well, that no one has done it in centuries. That didn't mean that it wasn't considered the goal of almost every modern-day enchanter to accomplish. The funny part, in Nick's opinion, was that there were in fact 2 or 3 people that he was aware of that could do it if they wanted to: Dumbledore, Grindelwald, and Flammel. Each had the mana and knowledge required to pull it off, but none of them felt the need to create such a thing. Nick completed the folds without any issue at all, and even got a peak rare grade for them, which was good. After that came the helmet, which he already had planned out, but needed to wait for a few moments to recover a little more mana. The enchantment for the helmet was basically an environmental type thing that allowed Nick to see, hear, and breath in any condition he found himself in. The words for this were Ranta, Sula, breath, Sinom, place, Sen, sight, and HLON, sound, which was one more than the other pieces of armor he had made so far. To his surprise, this resulted in a mythical grade item that could probably be considered an artifact of great value by itself. It did everything Nick wanted it to do, and more, as the helmet also granted a sort of 6th sense, as well as its ability for detecting danger. All things considered, it was a perfect tool for exploring foreign or unknown environments with harsh conditions. With it done, Nick called it a day, and made his way to the Great Hall for dinner alongside Dusk and Steve, who was on a diet to thin out. 472. Chapter 472. On the way to the great hall, Nick saw something that gave him pause. Helena was talking and smiling with Lupin in the hallway. Now that explains her absence a lot. I almost feel bad for the bloody Baron seeing this, he thought with a conflicted expression. On one hand, he was happy that Helena found someone who she fancied, but on the other hand, he felt that this was wrong for Lupin. Helena might be able to have a corporeal body, thanks to the ring on her hand, but the fact remained that she was very much still a ghost, and thus a terrible option for romance. As bad as it sounds, the entire purpose for finding a mate was to, well, mate and create offspring. That was not an option for ghosts like Helena, so Lupin romancing her was the equivalent of cutting off his bloodline, unless he chose to cheat on her, or they had a weird concubine-type deal later with a living woman. Nick refused to interfere, however, as they were both adults and could make their own choices and did not need his opinion on the matter. Truthfully, Nick knew that this was likely to happen when he created the way for ghosts to have corporeal bodies eventually. The idea of resurrecting Helena didn't even cross Nick's mind, as that was the height of unnatural and dark magics. Undoing death was not something that should ever be done lightly in his opinion, as the natural order existed for a reason. Even the resurrection stone didn't truly cross this line, but merely drew the soul of the one summoned back to this world from wherever they were, and allowed the holder to see and communicate with it. Even then, this placed the soul itself in great suffering the longer they lingered in this world, as unlike ghosts that were soul-bound to the earth by their magic, at the time of their deaths, these souls were already passed on to the afterlife, and thus no longer belonged in this world. The very world itself rejects them as a result and causes them agony for being brought here. In the end, Nick chose to let things run its course and ignore what he discovered. Speaking of the resurrection, Stone Harry was still oblivious to the fact he was wearing it on his hand, even now, which was kinda funny in Nick's opinion. All Harry knew was that it was an heirloom belonging to his bloodline, and that it likely had magical properties at some point, but was seemingly useless now beyond sentimental value. Nick got more than a little amusement seeing the rare interactions between Dumbledore and Harry, where the old goat looked lost while looking at the stone. Not because he was horribly tempted to use it or anything, but because the longer he held onto the Elder Wand, the more he started to notice that Nick was right. The wand wanted Harry to have it, and had been almost imperceptibly causing trouble to achieve this goal almost. Dumbledore was not some ignorant greenhorn, however, and could see these small traps clearly if he paid attention. The only reason Nick knew about this was that the old wizard had told him about it in hopes of seeking help in this regard. Nick had simply repeated the warning he gave the old man previously. Hand it over to Harry as soon as possible, and it will be fine. Dumbledore was not happy with this advice, but he at least explained that he understood where it was coming from. What Nick was curious about was what would happen if Harry had all three Hallows at once rather than at different times like in canon. Would he actually become the Master of Death, or would nothing at all happen besides him, just having three admittedly powerful magical items? Nick didn't know, but he was curious about it nonetheless. The cloak and ring clearly had some sort of resonance when used in tandem, not that Harry noticed, but it was incomplete and thus not fully able to manifest whatever it was trying to do. I will find out eventually anyways, so it doesn't really matter, Nick thought as he shook his head to clear out of his thoughts on the matter. The great hall was mostly empty since most of the students had gone home for the holidays. Nick sat down at the Gryffindor table with Dusk sitting on his shoulder, as per normal, and Steve on the other shoulder, with a miserable look. Nick ignored that though as the glutton had brought it on himself by allowing himself to get so fat and out of shape. Nick wasn't sure if being so fat could cause health problems in the creature, and was thus strict in maintaining a diet for Steve to slim it down. 473. Chapter 473. While most were used to seeing the sheer amount of food that Nick put away per meal, it still made some students uncomfortable. Nick couldn't help it, though, as between his growing body and the workout that forging gave him, his caloric intake had skyrocketed to nearly beastly levels. This meal, for example, consisted of 2 entire roast chickens, a large bowl of greens, 2 loaves of bread, and leg meat of an acromantula, which tasted like high-quality king crab meat. That didn't even mention dessert, which was also quite calorie-intensive. No one knew what the acromantula meat was, though, since the legs had been steamed, and the carapace removed, leaving only the soft red and white meat on a platter. As far as everyone could see, it just looked like someone had used the growth charm on some crabs and cooked the legs. No one else could ask for the dish, either, as Nick himself had provided the meat to the elves for it, and there was only enough for him. After his meal, Nick retrieved Nazgul and went to bed for the night. The next day, Nick went to work on the arm and shoulder parts of the armor. Specifically, he enchanted the right gauntlet to serve as an amplifier for his flame creation and manipulation bloodline ability. He used 4 words for this as well, in the form of Ranta, Na, fire, Karasta, build, and Tur, control. The left gauntlet did the same thing as the right, but for his lightning bloodline ability instead. That piece used the words Ranta, a glad, lightning, Karasta, and Tur for its enchantment. He then took the next 4 hours, much like the previous day, and worked on the Daedric book with slow progress just like before. He did, however, learn something that made him thankful he hadn't started the process recklessly after he reached that point. Once the process started, he was not able to leave the realm itself for at least 3 months, as his essence soaked into and permeated throughout the realm. The larger then realm, however, the more time this took, reaching up to potentially hundreds of years for the realms the size of the British Isles. Thankfully, Nick's realm was considered extremely tiny, and thus only needed 3 months if you give a day or 2 extra. Well, that kills any plans I had for summer, he thought with a sigh. Thankfully, the process to grow a realm larger by assimilating others didn't take nearly as much time, as it was less expanding one's existence like binding a realm, but more like digesting food to grow one's body instead. In theory, the same result, but in reality, it took more effort for one path than the other. The only time that it would take much more time was when Nick would assimilate the world into his realm in the future, that would require several years to accomplish, much like when Marlag Ball tried to assimilate Nirn into Cold Harbor. The process would take nearly a century to finish if Nick didn't want to break the Earth into base parts first, which he didn't. Still, it would be worth it in the end, as he would have an entire world with an already established ecosystem and civilization to himself, rather than having to spend the time to do all of that himself. The best part of binding a realm was that it would be turned Daedric in nature, meaning that the realm would automatically form its own creatures from the font of its existence loyal to him. This included full-fledged humanoid Daedra that would likely take after himself in form to a certain degree. Anyway, Nick put away the book after he finished recovering his mana and moved to decide what enchantments to use for the Vambrace and Rerebrace, since he was undecided. In the end, Nick chose to enchant the Vambraces for defensive purposes using 5 words each. These words were Ranta, Varia, protect, Tirith, guard, Torah, mighty, and Terma, shield. This didn't create a mythical grade set of Vambraces, but Nick could tell that they were only a hair away from it. The Rerebraces, on the other hand, were given an enchantment that raised the strength of the person wearing them. Nick used a total of 4 words for this: Ranta, Torah, Nid, force, and Polder, strong. These turned out peak rare grade as well, and had the effect Nick wanted, leaving him satisfied as he called it for the day there and went to eat dinner. He was close now to finishing the armor, but it would take nearly 2 more days to complete fully, as the cuirass was going to be a bit special. 474. Chapter 474. The next morning after breakfast, Nick got to work on enchanting the pauldrons with an environmental protection enchantment, much like his self-created space suit had. Nick didn't want this suit of armor to grant him greater strength in combat, but rather to allow him to go anywhere he wanted without issue. Each and every enchantment on the pieces of the armor served this purpose in some way, including the ones on the gauntlets. With the pauldron's environmental protection added to the set, this armor would become the ultimate tool for exploration and travel once he finished the cuirass. The 6 words he used for the pauldron's enchantment were Ranta, Kumar, void, Lelaim, travel, Varna, safe, Roban, wilderness, and Berthas, adventure. This was the highest amount of elvish runes he had ever used for an enchantment, other than when he was creating the Arda Milmi ring, and it showed. The final product took most of his energy to create and was nearing the middle point of the mythical grade, which was quite good all things considered. All that's left is the cuirass, and then this armor will be complete. It's going to be a bit difficult to complete on my own, though, Nick thought with a frown. The enchantment for the cuirass is going to be a bit special, as it was going to serve as the core or heart of the armor and blend each of the enchantments on the other parts together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The way this was going to be achieved, though, was the really special part, as Nick was going to attempt a ballad enchantment. Ballad enchantments were not a part of the Celebrimbor style despite being closely related. The reason for this was because the old elf had never been able to do it himself. An example of ballad enchanting was the song of creation that he had sang while creating the Arda Milmi ring. It definitely fell into the same branch of enchanting as the Celebrimbor style, but was of a higher tier and more of an instinctual thing than a thing that could be learnt. One could not simply train to achieve it, but had to have the right stimulus and conditions inherently alongside an opportunity for this gift to manifest. Nick had been avoiding it after the creation of the realm, as he feared what it may do to him. Ballad enchanting was a sort of harmonic resonance from one's very essence with what they were creating, and as a result, it was little different from broadcasting one's very essence aloud and exposed to the world. All it took was a single nefarious and correctly skilled being to interject during the song to cause devastating damage or corruption to his essence. Nick was fearful of this precise situation and was glad that nobody did such a thing when he created the realm previously. Then again, it also probably caught anyone aware of it off guard and thus unable to react. Such an enchantment was impossible to truly hide, as it was a worldly affair and was broadcast widely from the source of origin. This means that unlike last time, if the range of effect for this broadcast reached far enough, then people could attack him in the worst way possible through it, as they wouldn't be as caught off guard as the previous one. By singing the Song of Creation previously, Nick had unlocked the ability to actively ballad enchant, but refused to do so until now out of caution. This armor, however, deserved nothing less, and so he had chosen to do so for the first time actively. Your home on the island should suffice to muffle the ballad's range, thanks to the wards you have placed there, though I know not to what degree, Celebrimbor said solemnly. The old elf was the only person in this world who truly understood what ballad enchantments were as well as what they meant besides Nick. Due to this, he did not blame Nick at all for not using them more, and was just as concerned about potential attacks as Nick himself. The most famous attack on one singing a ballad enchantment was during the very creation of his own world, after all by Morgoth, who corrupted all of creation and tainted many higher spirits, one of which was his lieutenant, and later the very one that killed Celebrimbor and his family while perverting his creations, Sauron. So the old elf was intimately familiar with the horrible things that could occur during the ballad's singing. The rise of another Sauron through Nick's corruption was a possibility that he was very aware and afraid of as a result. 475. Chapter 475. Nick thought about it and found the suggestion reasonable, since while he doubted the wards around the island could completely contain the worldly phenomena of a ballad enchantment, it should be able to limit it. I think this will work, but I will create a few precautions just in case. Nick thought before opening the Daedric book again to study it while he waited for his mana to refill. He didn't make much progress during this time, but he had expected this, and so wasn't bothered by it. When he finally regained his mana, Nick stood up and transformed into his celestial bird form before vanishing from the workshop. His destination was the island, but was prevented entry by the wards that didn't allow for any form of teleportation. He expected this, and wasn't surprised to see that he was outside the ward before gliding down into the ward without issue. Even if he couldn't teleport straight into the island, the ward wasn't going to stop its master from physically entering it either. Saram clearly noticed Nick, but after observing him for a bit chose to go back to sleep once she determined who he was. She had seen the craziness of the Ravenclaw family's magical talent and easily shrugged off the discovery that one of them figured out how to turn into a magical beast. Nick himself couldn't care if she was surprised or not so long as she did her job, and smoothly glided to the manor's front yard before landing and turning back to his regular form. I need a few of the extra ward stones. He mentally reminded himself as he went in and headed for the enchanting room that held these things stored inside it. While large ward stones like the one in Hogwarts were rare and stupid hard to get, there was plenty of the smaller sort typically used in homes to hide the magical nature of the people living there. The stones themselves were actually fairly cheap and easy to get, but the really expensive part was getting a skilled warder to carve the wards into them. On the smaller stones typically used, it was delicate and fine work, because it was almost like writing a 6-page S on the surface space of a marble in terms of difficulty. Nick was going to use a small warding trick he found that ties several smaller wards together to get a stronger effect. Doing this for the room he was going to be conducting the ballad in chant, and he hoped to restrict the outflow of the ballad even further so that it didn't leave the island. Even if it did leave the island, the distance it would cover would be very small, so unless there was someone right outside the wards, he should be fine. Nick used Daedric runes for the miniature ward since they were tied to the soul and essence closely, and thus more capable of restricting the range than the other rune languages Nick had. Had to use a magnification spell and warder's pen in order to fully complete the wards on the small stones, but he did it and set the stone in place around the room before transforming and teleporting back to the workshop at Hogwarts after flying out of the island's wards. His arrival and departure from the island hadn't gone unnoticed, however, as while the Order of the Golden Sands wasn't going after him in hostility so long as he kept his head down, they weren't going to ignore him either. As a result, a sentry had been set in place near the island to keep an eye on any strange coming or goings from it, while simultaneously trying to crack the wards as well. Both parts of this mission were going poorly, however, as besides the regular coming and going of the house elf, nothing entered or left the island until now. The progress on the wards was even worse, as not only was the ward in a language entirely unknown, but the wards were constantly shifting as well without any pattern, so without a stupid amount of luck, no progress was able to be made. So when Nick showed up in his celestial bird form, the sentry was greatly startled and reported about it in great detail. The description that he gave sent a ripple through the Order's magizoologists, as they remembered a magical creature that caused a heavy blow to their order in the past after they tried to capture it. There was even a sketch of the creature in the records of the Order that, after getting looked over, made the one called the Elder scowl angrily. We thought we had seen the last of that damn bird, but it seems the brat has managed to fulfill the rebirth conditions for it, and now it's fucking unkillable. What a headache. The Elder said, in a gravely voice that sounded inhuman. 476. Chapter 476. Should we try and erase him for breaking the terms we put forth? A nearby woman asked seriously. The Elder shook their head. The brat hasn't actually broken the terms we set, as we never said he had to stop growing, but that he needed to stop drawing attention to us. And while he was clearly pushing the limit with this new sport, it didn't reflect back on us at all. It doesn't matter if he did break the terms anyways, as the little bastard has gotten the support of the Flammels, Dumbledore, and even the entire royal clan of the vampires. If it was only one of these, we might be able to handle the backlash for attacking him, but with all three, the damage we would suffer is not worth it. The raspy, inhuman voice of the Elder spoke from under their hood. The woman didn't say anything at that point, as she understood just how badly they were outmatched by the supports Nick was gathering for himself. A mid-tier 4, 2 tier 5s, and whatever the royal vampires counted as compared to their own forces that had no tier 4s, and the only tier 5 is unable to leave the mana gathering array without risking death. Meanwhile, the figure of a black-haired woman could be seen walking across the top of the sea to the north of the British Isles with a smouldering look of rage on its face. The creature was greatly angered by the fact that its prey had managed to affect it in such a way and force it away. It, the predator, had been repelled by its prey. This was an insult like no other in the creature's mind, as it fully believed that its prey should submit for consumption quietly. What angered it even further was that the place it had been sent to lacked any substantial magic, so the creature suffered hunger pains as it quickly burned through its supply to escape this predicament. It had thought of apparating back to the land, but its many minds' worth of memories told it that would likely use a dangerous amount of its energy, so it was forced to use a low-energy means of returning that was far slower. The really infuriating thing, though, was that it was being observed from far in the sky by what it considered prey, but whenever it moved to consume the prey it fled with what the creature knew to be a portkey before another prey took its place observing. Nick was unaware of these things, of course, as he was dealing with his own work. For example, he was storing his astral anvil as well as hammer from the workshop, since he needed them for the ballad. The normal anvil in the enchantment room of the manor simply couldn't handle the resonant force of the ballad and would be destroyed. This didn't even consider that, after the ballad was started, each piece of the armor would start sucking in massive amounts of mana to link together. Thankfully, for Nick, using a ballad enchantment was akin to resonating with the world, so all the ambient mana was temporarily at his disposal in the area covered by the phenomena. On the island, this was a substantial amount of mana, thanks to the array gathering and concentrating it there. Once he got everything together, Nick transformed again and returned to the island, though before going in he flew over the nearby sea to see if there was any Order members hiding nearby. He was in luck, as it would have it, as there was in fact one hiding under the magical cloaking. He instantly blasted that location with a huge amount of fire and lightning, which did the trick as whoever it was died before they could figure out they were in danger. After checking the area again and finding nothing out of place, Nick was satisfied and flew into the island. It didn't take him very long to arrive in the enchanting room and start setting up the anvil and armor for the ballad enchantment. He took a deep breath as he held his hammer and raised it up before striking the cuirass. Much like last time, he began to sing, and the mana in the air began to dance and sway in tune with his voice. It was a song without words, but full of meaning and power, as his will and essence resonated with the world with each strike. The life on the island paused regardless if it was a powerful creature or an insect, as the resonance rolled over them before getting stopped at the wards for the island and contained within. 477. Chapter 477. In a funny sort of way, ballad enchantments were even simpler to do for Nick than the Celebrimber style he had mastered via effort. This was due to the instinctual nature of the art that did not require mastery via training, but merely going with the flow. Nick released all illusions of control and allowed the song to shape itself as it wished as the armor on the anvil glowed and hummed in tune while drawing the mana from the air. Slowly, each piece of armor began to connect mystically and meld their individual enchantments together. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of a heart beating filled the air as the cuirass pulsed on its own as the enchantments synchronized on it. The ballad also started to reach its conclusion, and with a last note the process completed and the entirety of the mana on the island was sucked into the armor. It refilled shortly afterwards, but Nick could care less about that as he looked at the glowing silver-blue armor on the anvil in disbelief. Unlike what he had expected, the armor wasn't rare or even mythical grade, but legendary. Armor, Rani Seron, not Sauron, Wandering Wizard grade. Legendary abilities, auto-sizing, environmental adaptation, defensive shield, flame lord, lightning lord, flight, growth, spatial skip, balanced, giant's might, core repair mythical ability, wanderer's sanctum. Once a day allows the wearer to create a habitable location where they are free from danger. Legendary ability, ballad of travel, grants the wearer the ability to safely travel to any destination they have discovered previously 3 times as month. Description, a legendary creation made to be the ultimate traveler's tool. System appraisal, a powerful tool that will change history and forge its legend with every step its wearer takes, created by an established smith. Truly a wondrous creation, Celebrimber says proudly. It's almost perfect for what I wanted it to do, and even goes several steps further. Nick thought in awe as he ran a finger along the feather patterns on the cuirass. Checking the mission, Nick was even more satisfied to see that he had completed that optional objective and turned in the mission getting his rewards. A black leather-bound book titled Space and You, and a new crafting-style ticket. The book was a very high-end tome on spatial magic, which Nick was thrilled to have. The crafting method ticket, however, was going to be left alone for quite some time, as he was still figuring out the Twilight style, and unlike when he got it, he was not even close to mastering the style. Adding on a new one might open up his options a bit, but it would also force him to split his attention between the two styles, which he was unwilling to do. Rather than that, Nick preferred focusing his energy on mastering the Twilight style and his own magical power. Putting the armor on Nick was slightly miffed to notice it had to make a small adjustment in size in a couple places, but otherwise it fit perfectly. Now to see if my wards or Hogwarts wards will stop me from traveling there, he thought as he took a step forward while activating one of the 3 uses of the legendary ability. Instantly, the surroundings changed, and Nick found himself in the workshop at the school. It was disorienting despite him knowing how the ability worked, as he felt like he took a single step, and yet was suddenly in a totally different location. This ability is absurdly broken. I didn't feel even the slightest resistance at all, Nick thought as he looked at his surroundings. In that case, I believe the limit of 3 uses per month is quite reasonable, as this ability borders on omnipresence, Celebrimber said seriously. Nick agreed with that assessment as well, since with this ability he could be almost anywhere at any given instance. Comparing the armor to the staff of Asclepius, Nick found that the two couldn't even be compared properly with how far apart they were, despite both being legendary items. It was like the armor was a muggle, while the staff was Dumbledore, a massive disparity in power. Despite that, Nick was still happy with the armor, as it was his first legendary creation that was at that grade from the start. The Arda Milmi ring was also legendary at this point, but that was because it had grown into a sort of miniature world in its own right, which brought about a qualitative change from when it was first created. Interestingly, however, the ring didn't gain a new legendary ability after reaching that point, but the mythical ability turned into the legendary ability instead. 478. Chapter 478. Nick assumed that this was how all growth enchanted items of his would roughly work, but it was entirely possible that the realm ring was special in this regard. He simply couldn't know until another one reached mythical or legendary grade, though. Even his earliest growth enchanted item hadn't grown to that point, yet due to the standard way that the enchantment grew. The realm ring grew by him, feeding it literal space and matter which were in abundance, thus making its growth not very unusual at all. Other growth enchanted things, however, grew with the person that wore them. Harry's protective ring was first created at the low end of the rare grade, but had since then reached the peak of it and was but a step away from mythical grade. The fact remained, however, that it was not yet at mythical grade, so Nick wasn't sure quite what that would change in the ring. From what he could tell by the system, the transition from rare to mythical was the defining point for craftsmen to be considered genuinely skilled, and by extension the point between an all-right item and a good one. Nick wasn't quite sure what the system was basing this scale off of, but he assumed it had to do with the level of skill that some beings in the multiverse had at crafting. If that was true, then he was indeed on a bit above average in terms of skill, since he wasn't arrogant enough to compare his skill with a being like Hephaestus, that was likely just as talented in crafting as he was, and had far more experience in it as well. It needed to be understood that Hephaestus was born a god, and thus was inherently far more capable of learning than even Nick himself was at this moment in time. Add on what was likely thousands of years of honing his skill and knowledge, and it was easy to understand how outmatched Nick was in this department. If anything, Nick was incredibly happy about this as well, since when the Forge Guard returned, Nick would be able to seek out tutelage from him to rapidly increase his crafting prowess. There was no doubt in his mind that the Forge Guard would happily trade knowledge with him, as regardless of all else Nick's crafting styles weren't native to this world at all, and thus would be considered new and exciting for the Guard. With the mission complete, Nick could finally relax and focus entirely on his own self-improvement. Interestingly enough, Dumbledore also informed Nick that thanks to his work, The Ministry had more than enough rings of protection for the wizards of the British Isles and surrounding wizarding communities. Each community only had about 3,000 or 4,000 wizards total, so the 250,000 rings he made went a very long way in preparing for the upcoming recovery of the planet. Dumbledore told Nick that he could stop making so many rings of protection, but that more would always be appreciated. In an interesting addition, Dumbledore also asked for a rather large amount of space metal, as the preliminary preparations for the attempt at trapping the abomination had been completed at the coast. The trap was basically a very large formation that looped space at its center that was inactive magically, so the abomination didn't notice it until it was already within it, by which point it would be too late. According to Dumbledore, the formation even had the useful property of allowing things to enter it without allowing them to leave afterwards, so the Muggle gun he acquired would still be useful. The gun was a bit questionable, as it was an old M1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle that Dumbledore had somehow managed to acquire. The old goat swore that he got it through standard methods, but Nick had a hard time believing that. He couldn't be blamed, since the rifle was practically an antique, despite the condition it was in that made it seem like it had just came off the factory line. Still, Nick took the gun anyways to take it apart to enchant for his purpose. As it was, the gun was nearly inoperable from the magic in the air, causing the gunpowder in the bullets to not ignite. As a result, Nick entirely removed the bullets from the gun and got to work replicating the effect of them without the black powder. It wasn't particularly hard, as he merely needed to engrave a few burst runes on the inside of the shell, along with a trigger rune to set them off. Thankfully, the firing mechanism of the gun was merely a matter of springs and levers, so the gun itself had no trouble at all receiving the auto-aim and reloading enchantment Nick designed for it. 479. Chapter 479. Nick, of course, tested the final result and was pleased to find that not only did it work, but it was even better than the original way the gun worked, as the burst runes applied all that force directly on the bullet itself, giving it far greater force behind each one compared to the confined explosions that the original black powder used. All in all, Nick considered it a great success, even if enchanting each individual bullet became rather tedious for him. As a cherry on top, Nick even asked Snape for a non-magical poison that would survive being shot out, just in case the bullets actually hit the abomination. Nick doubted that the bullets would actually enter the abomination's body, but he was nothing if not thorough. This request was easily accommodated by the potion master, as he crafted one such poison in merely a few moments' time. It was a green and purple gel that was apparently toxic enough to deal lethal damage to a blue whale in about 2 minutes from internal necrosis. Nick made sure not to physically touch any of the stuff, as he coated the bullets in it as a result. After completing his highly illegal gun, Nick spent the next 3 days studying the Daedric book until it was finally Christmas morning. It was a cold and snowy day like always when Nick got up that day to find the presents at the foot of his bed. Unlike usual, however, there was many more than any of the previous years combined to his horror and confusion. So many, in fact, that the floor of the dorm room was practically covered in them. Picking up the nearest one to himself, without leaving his bed, Nick read the tag and sighed as he understood where they all came from. These were nearly all gifts from wizards around the world that wanted to thank him for creating Blitz Ball. I knew sports fans were balmy as hell, but this is just too much. He mentally complained as he started opening the gifts. He, of course, checked each one for curses and tampering first, of course, but he didn't find any like that. The gifts came from all corners of the globe and reflected that with the ungodly amount of local sweets and food items he received. That was what most of the gifts comprised of, but not all of them. There were other things as well, such as signed Blitz Balls from a few of the first teams that had been put together, which Nick decided to place in a special collection. The teams weren't super famous now or anything, but that would likely change in the future, making these signed balls valuable collector's items. The weirdest thing Nick got, however, was a necklace made from the bones of an albino man from an African wizard. It had a strange enchantment on it that apparently boosted one's fertility, which earned weird looks from Nick. He was pretty sure that it was a cultural difference that made it seem so strange and chose to keep it anyways. Ron had woken up while Nick was opening his gifts and looked like his eyes were going to fall out from how wide they were. Bloody hell, just look at all of this stuff. I wonder if I would also get so many gifts if I made a sport too, Ron said enviously. If you think you can, then please by all means do so. Fair warning though, it's not an easy task since there are rules, environment, and various other factors to consider, Nick said with a smirk, since he knew Ron was practically allergic to normal studying. Hard pass, the redhead said with a shiver at the mere thought of dealing with all that. Eventually, though, Nick managed to get to the normal gifts from his friends, and those who consider him on good terms with them, like some members of the Hogwarts staff. He couldn't help but have a bit of an eye twitch at the sheer amount of gifts were food-related, but he knew he only had himself to blame. His monstrous consumption of food was a well-known thing amongst the school, and after the reporters went digging for information on him, the entire world who read the article. It was so bad, in fact, that he had been dubbed the Ravenous Creator by the reporter, and to Nick's horror the title stuck. Even the system recognized the title from how many people agreed to it in the world. Still, there were a few other gifts that weren't food-related, such as Daphne's, that was a book on healing magic related to curses. Nick wasn't ignorant enough not to notice that this was her way of hinting at him to try and cure the curse on the Greengrass bloodline. 480. Chapter 480. Nick sighed when he noticed this, and was conflicted, since on one hand he felt a bit bad that he kept forgetting to look into her family's curse. On the other hand, however, it was her faith in him to be able to just casually find a cure for it that set a dangerous precedent. If he did indeed create a cure, then she may develop absolute faith in his capabilities, which is very bad should she be put in a life-threatening situation in the future. Nick's solution to the problem was quite simple, really, as he merely needed to find the cure and then sneakily implant it into a Mediwitch's head as a sort of spark of inspiration. In that case, he will seemingly have nothing to do with the cure at all, and thus there will be no reason for Daphne to develop that dangerous mindset. He even had the perfect target in mind for the information after he figured it out, Madame Pomfrey. The school's resident Mediwitch was likely the one currently treating the symptoms of the curse on a regular basis. She also already most likely had the required knowledge to find a cure, but hadn't been able to so. It would take a small nudge with legilimency to convince her she figured it out on her own as a result. All the while Nick would not be suspect at all, since as far as everyone could tell, he would have nothing to do with the discovery. The key to this plan, however, revolved around two things that no one knows at the moment. First, that he was likely the most powerful legilimens on the planet after following Slytherin's training method for the subject for nearly 3 years. Second, was that he could read any language, and thus could likely find the curse itself easily enough in the library if he looked. The reason these were key was because Madame Pomfrey was an Occlumens like every other Mediwitch, and had powerful shield around her mind to keep others out. Dumbledore himself would probably be unable to sneak into her mind without brute force as a result, but Nick could, since those shields were likely pathetic compared to the natural mental protection that Dusk had. In the second case, it was obviously because without being able to read every language, Nick wouldn't be able to find the curse and figure out a way to dispel it from what he learned. As it stood right now, Nick already had 2 of 3 of Slytherin's medical curse breaking pieces of information, and just needed the last one. Slytherin created this rule of 3 after a lot of experiments on the subject. The rules stated that a Mediwitch or wizard needed 3 pieces of information to safely remove any curse from someone. First was the method of casting the curse. Second was an understanding of what the curse did to the victim, and the final was the reverse curse technique that was needed to create a counter-curse. The reverse curse technique was one of the first things Slytherin's books spoke of on the topic in great detail, and the effects of the curse were observable by Nick, fulfilling 2 of the 3 requirements. The final one needed to be fulfilled in order for Nick to create the counter-curse that he would sneakily feed to Madame Pomfrey, who was definitely trying to figure it out herself already. With all this in mind, Nick stored away Daphne's gift and moved on to the rest. Lupin got Nick a copy of the Marauder's map he made just for him, which was nice, but functionally useless for him. Sirius, on the other hand, just directly sent Nick an Earth-Fire seed, which was actually useful to Nick, since it will let him create an Earth-Fire Atronach. Earth-Fire was a sort of magical flame found within active volcanoes, or deep beneath the ground, that added a high adaptability to whatever it was added to. Nick even had a sneaking suspicion that it was what Godric Gryffindor's sword was forged, in that allowed it to devour the properties of things that would strengthen it. He couldn't prove it, of course, since the sword was lost to time, and hadn't manifested from the Sorting Hat since Nick derailed the hell out of the canon events of the second year. Other than that point in time, there had been no occasion by which it needed to manifest, so it sat within the hat to this very day. Thinking of the sword, Nick found it a bit ironic that Slytherin's pet would have been done in by his best friend's weapon had Nick not intervened. 481. Chapter 481. Other than that, there wasn't really any presents worth mentioning, and the rest of the day was fairly quiet, as well minus the small snowball fight the twins started. Nick didn't take part in it, but watched from the sidelines while under a shield charm. Not for lack of effort on the twins' part, to be fair, as they kept, accidentally, hitting the shield from different angles in search of a weakness. Nick was not foolish enough to leave such a thing, however, and merely smirked as he sipped his Mexican hot chocolate. Something about the added red pepper really elevated the drink in his opinion, and Darty was always happy to make stuff like this for him if he asked. Ron was also a huge fan of the drink after trying some, and had his own mug next to Nick. There was nothing really special about it, but it was nice to just sit around and chat with friends without studying or worrying about the upcoming mana recovery and returning guards. Still, all good things come to an end, and the day soon waned away before a new one started. There is 6 days left before the holidays end, so I should probably visit that place in Iceland, Slytherin, mentioned to see if my theory holds. Nick thought the morning after Christmas, as he was deciding what to do for the remaining time he had left before the classes started up again. From what he could tell, Slytherin was at the 3rd tier when he visited that place, so Nick figured he would have no issue after going there himself. The country was only a bit over 500 miles northwestish, so while flying high into the air at about Mach, one should get him there in a bit under an hour. Darning his armor, Nick placed a disillusionment charm on himself before leaving the castle through the courtyard. Once outside, he willed himself up and instantly shot upwards like an arrow released from a bow. After reaching the clouds, he stopped to allow the armor to adjust to the environment as he determined the direction he needed to go before shooting off into the distance. Only Dumbledore seemed to notice his departure, but merely shrugged and went back to his paperwork. This was not the first time Nick had shot past the wards through the sky, after all, and the old wizard doubted it would be the last as well. The armor's inbuilt shields covered the head and shoulders of the armor as he flew, which increased its aerodynamics greatly. This allowed Nick to bust through the sound barrier and enter the soundless state that existed beyond it. This wasn't to say that he wasn't making sound, merely that he was moving faster than it was so he himself could not hear it. Luckily, he quickly reached the ocean, so those that heard the sound of his travel were few and far between. Nick didn't pay much attention to his surroundings, as he flew, as the only things he needed to watch were in front of him in the form of birds. If his eyesight wasn't extremely good, and his reaction speed being superhuman, he might not have been able to dodge the few he came across that were cruising at this altitude. After about 45 minutes, he spotted his destination ahead of him and started to slow down, which brought back a disorienting amount of noise. Still, he safely arrived on the southeastern part of the country and began his search for the spot Slytherin described. This was slightly tricky, as there was quite a lot of volcanic activity in the southern part of the country that threw off his magical senses slightly from the earth fire there. After about 2 hours of careful searching, however, Nick finally got a magical return that didn't belong to the earth fire. In his senses, it felt like something that was trying to go unnoticed, which was ironically what gave it away to him. If he was going off of sight, or something like that, then Slytherin's ward would have worked perfectly, as his notice would have slipped right over it. but in his magical senses, something telling him not to notice, it tended to do the opposite. Moving the large amount of rock covering the entrance, Nick entered the crevice cautiously after dismantling the ward and replacing it behind him. Like he had expected, the crevice was very hot, but thanks to both his natural resistance to high temperatures and the armor that adapted and protected him from it, he was perfectly fine. Eventually, he found his first traces of the metal guardians that Slytherin spoke of, in the form of broken pieces of a hole that Nick figured the Founders team had left behind. 482. Chapter 482. Nick picked up the pieces and observed them, but frowned as he couldn't identify it. At first glance, it appeared to be bronze, but it was far too sturdy to actually be it, and there was no corrosion at all despite the enchantments on the metal being destroyed for over 1,000 years. Using the system, Nick analyzed the pieces and smiled at what it told him. The metal was called Olympium and was an alloy created by Hephaestus that the Forge Guard used for most of their intricate works. Even more surprisingly was that the pieces belonged to a magical drone created out of the metal. This raised Nick's hopes greatly that this was indeed the location that Hephaestus was sealed, but the possibility that it was just the tomb of a powerful wizard that found the alloy also existed. Knowing this, Nick collected as much pieces as he could and continued on his way further into the crevice. The walls got smoother and wider the deeper he went, while more and more pieces of drones showed up, and Nick had even started to find some more whole constructs. The general body shape he could see for the majority of these drones was vaguely arachnid-like, except they had clamps on their front for manipulating things. Nick couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about their shape bothered him, like he should know what they were, but at the same time, he shouldn't as well. It was a weird sort of déjà vu rather than anything actually paradoxical in nature, and it was driving him crazy. In the end, he could only continue collecting the drones as he went deeper into the stone structure underground. What is this place? There is almost no magic at all besides these drones, and even then most of them have long since lost all power or been destroyed. If anything, this place seems almost entirely mechanical in nature. Nick thought in confusion the more the stone started to look as if it had been carved long ago and inlaid with metal pipes and plating. Even stranger was that he could hear steam moving through the pipes to somewhere further in. There was plenty of traps along the way, but again, none were magical, and most had even been disabled prior to his arrival. Nick pushed open a large set of metal doors that stood in his way further in, and for the first time since entering this place found a working drone. This one was different than the others, however, as it looked almost humanoid. If it wasn't for the strange rolling wheels it used to move about, and weapon hands. The right hand was a mechanical blade, while the left appeared to be a sort of crossbow without a string. Again, Nick had a horrible sense that he should know what this was, but couldn't for the life of him figure out why. The drone also spotted him, and steam rose from the side of its head, and it turned violent and raised its crossbow arm to fire a bolt at him. Nick waved his wand, creating a shield that stopped the bolt before immediately pointing at the drone, Immobulus. He spoke, and the spell appeared in a flash of blue, causing the drone to stiffen in place, as it was magically paralyzed. Nick walked over to it at this point and began examining the enchantments on it carefully. They were horribly complex, actually, as there was a sort of primitive AI that detected race and dictated the actions of the drone as a result, as well as a set of tasks that it would need to perform in various scenarios. These enchantments are some else entirely. It's like a form of mechanical life, with that last step not being taken to truly make it alive. Even stranger is that it seems to be intentional as well. Nick thought with a deep frown, as once again a part of his being was screaming at him that he should know what this is and what made it. Disrumper, Nick said with a flick of his wrist, and the drone lost its enchantment before falling to the ground in perfectly intact pieces that Nick collected to put together again later. Looking around the room, Nick saw 3 other doors that went in 3 different directions, so he on a whim chose to take the one to his left. Behind that door was what appeared to be a bedroom to his surprise, and had a metal mechanically locked chest, a stone bed, a table with stone chairs, and a bookshelf with what looked to be the remains of books on it. The books were sadly reduced to fragments, and Nick felt like maybe the repair charm might hopefully fix them. 483. Chapter 483. This means missing text. Reparo, he spoke softly, and the magic struck the haphazard pile of book remains, and Nick watched hopeful that he could learn something about whoever built this place. It was slow going, but eventually the magic finished running its course, and Nick sighed at what he saw. The few books that were able to be salvaged to a degree were repaired to that degree, and not a big one either. Whatever, something is better than nothing. He thought as he started looking at the script written on the parts of the paper that was legible. Strange lands I have arrived at after. It's been days since I arrived in this place, and I have made several discoveries that I recently had a run-in with the local race of men in this world, and diplomacy fell through. As we don't speak the same language, drastic measures need to be taken to rectify this. That was all that was understandable in the first book, and Nick made an inference based on the context clues written within these scant few lines. This was that whoever constructed this place was not from this world, which was shocking. He had long theorized that it was entirely possible to travel to other realities after he himself had done so after he died, but from his understanding, it was extremely difficult to do while alive. Souls he had found were more energy than anything else, so it took much less effort to send this energy to another place compared to a physical body well attuned to its world. Unfortunately, these books were in terrible condition, and as a result were lacking the details Nick needed to try and figure out how this person got here from wherever they came from. Moving on to the next book, Nick found a reference that he recognized, and he finally understood why he had been having such a bad case of déjà vu. After scrying this entire world, I have come to a startling conclusion. There are no Mer here nor Deidre. My realization of finding myself in an entirely new reality has led to a sense of dread setting in. I am truly alone. That was the only legible entry in the second book, and it told Nick exactly what wrote the entry and where they came from. A Dwmer from Nern was in this world at some point. This was an earth-shattering discovery, as the implications behind such a thing was insane for various reasons. It was a well-recorded fact that the Dwemer were basically all mad scientist types, with little regard for other races being contempt and disdain. It was so bad, in fact, that the leader of them in a single part of the world went so far as trying to forcefully elevate the entire race to divinity rather than try and make peace with their enemies. This arrogant act caused nearly the entire race to go extinct as they zero-summed from existence. Nick had a burning desire to know if this particular Dwemer arrived in this world because of that act, or if they had come to this world before that point somehow. Both possibilities came with their own implications and weight, but both were different. If the Dwemer came as a result of Kagranak's folly them, it was also possible that others of that race, or even the majority of that race, had been translocated to different realities. If the Dwemer came via other means, however, it means there may be the key knowledge to dimensional travel somewhere in this place. I don't know exactly when this person arrived on Earth, but I assume it was either after the guards died off or sealed themselves away, or the guards never noticed them for some reason. Nick thought seriously before moving to the next book. An astounding discovery. I have managed to leech off the magicka of the object to power my home eye. The seals still hold tight, but I shall persevere to discover what secret they hide from me. I am dying. I almost didn't realize it, but my magicka is consuming me to maintain itself slowly. Weakness in my bones as I write this last entry. So this person seems to have arrived after the guards vanished, and was being tier 4, but not by much. Nick noted after he finished the book. Unfortunately, even using the repair charm again and again did nothing to recover the lost texts, which left him with many questions and no answers. He was hopeful, however, as there was mention of seals, which means a guard might still be here. With that in mind, Nick left the room and walked to the door to the right of the center hallway room and pushed it open. 484. Chapter 484. Immediately after opening the door, Nick leapt backwards as several attacks came at him from within the room. He didn't realize it until the door was open, but there was 3 drones within the room set to ambush whoever opened it incorrectly. I forgot that the Dwmer were clever pricks and did shit like this, he thought as he quickly immobilized and dismantled the drones like the previous one. Even if the Dwemer who made them was Tier 5 or higher, the drones themselves were simple constructions that were only a true threat to a wizard like Nick if he was caught off guard. That was because the things lacked any real magical means of attacking and relied on physical means to cause damage. Even worse was that they had no resistance to this world's form of magic at all that wasn't so focused on destruction as opposed to utility. For all the gifts the people of Nirn had with their thriving mana-rich world, they sucked at getting creative with their spells and tended to rely on brute force for everything. While Nick can't say that was wrong, it just meant that this world's magic system had an edge in utility and finesse by a wide margin. The Dwemer themselves likely wasn't aware of this at the time they created these drones, and thus simply chose to stick to the traditional automatons of their race. Nick chuckled and shook his head at this before focusing on the task at hand. Walking into the room, he smiled, as how could he not recognize a workshop when he saw one? The whole room was well preserved thanks to the type metal used for the tools and the enchantments on everything that stopped time's ravages. Oh yes, the room was absolutely blinding to Nick's magical senses, as the whole place had preservative enchantments on them that he recognized as being written in Daedric runes. He wasn't surprised at this, since most enchantments from Nirn used the language as a base for their enchantments and spellcraft. And why wouldn't they when Daedra and Idra were the constant and ever-present reminder of the most powerful beings in their reality, that they were aware of anyways? Even calling it Daedric runes was technically incorrect, as it belonged to the Idra as well, though to be fair, the Daedra were the first to share the knowledge of the language with the mortal races. Hermias Mora, to be precise, was the one responsible for the spread of that knowledge to the mortals. Nick had to admit it was a smart move of the Prince of Secrets and Fate's part, as it was a foregone conclusion that the mortal races would get that knowledge eventually on their own, so why not skip the hassle and get it over with in exchange for some profit for himself? The funny part, in Nick's opinion, was that the Daedric Lord clearly hadn't realized exactly how far the mortals would take that piece of knowledge at the time. The Dwemer, more than any other race, proved their hegemony in the usage of the language, as they made false life, and even tapped into tonal magic, which was a whole complicated and super high-tier piece of magic. The crazy race even got uncomfortably close to creating a new guard using the heart of one as a fuel source. Nick was frankly speaking thrilled with the workshop's discovery, as even without the knowledge of the one who made it, he could at the very least copy the enchantments and then figure out bits and pieces of how the Dwemer crafted stuff. The biggest gain, however, was an apple-sized metal cube-looking object that had sat in a special pedestal in the center of the workshop. A lexicon, nice. Nick thought excitedly, since he knew that the things were used by the Dwemer as a sort of portable library for knowledge. This one was obviously empty, as it had no magical signals at all, but with some luck Nick could use it to reverse engineer the magical technology behind it for his own use. This would be a huge step forward for him, as using this technology, he could inscribe an entire library's worth of knowledge onto a lexicon that could then be directly injected into his mind to instantly gain all of it. It wasn't exactly learning that fast so much as allowing him to directly skip the reading step of gaining knowledge and letting him work on directly memorizing it all instead. He wasn't the only one who would benefit from this technology, either, as he could inscribe the entire Hogwarts library into a lexicon and have all of it injected into the first years of the school to basically elevate the entire British wizarding community's future generations' knowledge and power by a wide margin. 485. Chapter 485. Snapping himself out of his wondrous fantasies, Nick took out one of his many blank journals and began copying the enchantments on literally every part of the room, from the tools to the furniture. All of it was copied down exactly as it was seen. The Dwemer had thought themselves clever and made sure that the enchantments on the tools were all vague and bound permanently to themselves, so they were useless to anyone else, but Nick had no intention of preserving the enchantments at all. He could get better versions from the system and enchant them himself, so his only use for the tools was the material they were made from. Speaking of said material, Nick couldn't figure out how the Dwmer had gotten so much to begin with that it could be used as mere decoration for this place beyond the drones and tools. The stuff was literally all over the place, and Nick found this odd since it made no sense. As an unnaturally created alloy, the metal should be in short supply, yet the Dwemer seemed to have more than they knew what to do with. Perhaps I'll find out why by going deeper into the complex, he thought after packing up the whole room's contents into the realm. Leaving the now empty room, Nick finally chose to go through the middle door that, to no surprise, had a long downward sloping hallway behind it. Like the rest of the Dwemer, the hallway was made of stone and metal with pipes along its sides. There were also a few traps here and there that Nick spotted and easily avoided by floating over them with his armor. Obviously, the Dwemer had never expected a flying intruder when they made the traps, so they were entirely ineffective against Nick. The hallway went on, and on for nearly an hour of slowly floating down it, as the temperature gradually grew greater and greater. Finally, Nick made it to the huge set of heavily enchanted and locked doors that he assumed contained the final part of the ruin. Dear gods, that is an insane amount of protection. Clearly that Dwemer did not want anyone to see what is behind this door. Nick thought with conflicting emotions about it. On one hand, he was impressed by the defenses, while on the other, they irritated him for being such a pain to get past. Anti-magic protection enchantments galore, and no less than 3 super complicated puzzle locks that didn't have any context to them at all. 2 days. It took Nick 2 whole days to figure out the combinations for the locks and finally open the doors. Even then, he only figured them out by trying literally every possible combination until he got the right ones. It was all worth it in his opinion, however, as he finally pushed open the doors and saw what lay beyond them. A vast lake of molten metal that had Dwemer constructs attached to it, and in the very center, a huge crystalline structure that sent chills down his spine. Not from its appearance, but because of the sheer quality and quantity of mana contained within it that passively seeped out in tiny amounts. Deific presence confirmed, now to ignore my instincts and try and figure out which god it is. Nick thought seriously as he moved to try and float over the metal lake. The key word there was try, as the moment he approached the lake it moved as something started to surface from below it. First came a reptilian head with well-visible fangs that were each nearly twice the size of Nick himself at the minimum. It had huge bronze-colored scales with jagged edges on its neck, down alongside long, thick black horns from behind its skull, and a massive, bulky body like that of a monitor lizard, but scaled up to the point of being nearly the size of an entire football field. The creature didn't have wings, but it didn't need them for Nick to know what it was: a dragon. You wouldn't happen to know how to talk, would you? Nick asked, hoping to avoid conflict with the monstrous creature if possible. That hope was killed brutally as the dragon opened its mouth and unleashed a torrent of golden-colored flames at Nick. He wasted no time at all shooting to the side as fast as his armor would let him, barely avoiding the flames that covered a huge area. Obscuro, Nick called as he used the blinding curse to try and take away the dragon's vision, which was a highly recommended move against the creatures. The hide of a dragon is ridiculously resistant to magic, and only the eyes were vulnerable normally, so removing that sense was a no-brainer when dealing with one. Nick was pretty sure that this dragon in particular would prove to be a pain to defeat considering where it was living. 486. Chapter 486. It would take an idiot to not realize that this dragon was leeching off the mana that radiated from the crystal and saturated the molten metal of the lake. Nick was no idiot and could easily recognize this fact, and sigh as he shot around the huge cavern's airspace to avoid the dragon's attacks. To make matters worse, Nick's senses told him a fact about the dragon that had him conflicted about killing the beast as well. It was Tier 5. Not the weak sort of Tier 5, either, like Slytherin, who hadn't gone beyond the entry point of that tier, but full-on solidly within the tier. Nick was conflicted about killing the creature, because he was well aware that this could very well be the only Tier 5 dragon on the entire planet, and was an entirely unknown species to boot. Simply killing such a thing for his own convenience when it wasn't strictly necessary just didn't sit right with him. Boom! A blast of flame on a nearby wall said that the dragon itself had no such issues about killing him, however, as it wildly attacked after the blinding spell took hold. One might be wondering how Nick wasn't already dead against the dragon if it was 2 whole tiers above him, and this would be a good question if it was a wizard. Magical beasts, however, functioned differently than wizards and other intelligent species, such as goblin, when it came to tiers of power. A normal dragon was actually tier 4 on average, which means they should be as strong as Dumbledore, and yet they could be restrained by even tier 2 wizards with the right strategy. The reason for this was because while their power and mana levels were well into tier 4, they were basically just great big brutes that lacked the versatility and minds required to fully utilize this power like wizards do. Put it bluntly, this dragon, while powerful, was just flinging around its power without and direction or restraint at all, which was of course dangerous, but only if Nick was an idiot and let it hit him. Despite their lack of intelligence, dragons weren't stupid beasts by any means, so it didn't take long for this one to realize that Nick couldn't be gotten in this way and switch up tactics. To be specific, Nick watched it dive back under the molten metal of the lake and vanish from his magical senses. It couldn't be helped, as the molten metal was constantly radiating mana from the crystal that cut off his perception at the surface of the lake. This made Nick vigilant, as he knew that this meant that the beast could try and ambush him from beneath the metal. To prevent any accidents, he flew to the top of the cavern and summoned a double-layered shield charm as he watched the molten metal for any signs of movement. It was hard to tell what was movement from the dragon and what was the natural flow of the molten metal until the spot right below him sank downwards noticeably, and he shot to the side just in time to avoid a blast of flame directed at his previous position. He didn't escape entirely unharmed, however, as his left foot got hit by the edge of the attack and was horribly scorched as a result. TSSSS. He hissed in pain and grit his teeth to stop himself from screaming and tried to maintain his focus on surviving and defeating this dragon. I can heal the damage later if I survive that long. He thought seriously as he never stopped moving to prevent another attack like that. This clearly got the dragon impatient as it began to visibly chase him from beneath the metal, causing large amounts of disturbances on the surface as it did so. Glacius, Nick said loudly, and a dense amount of icy air shot out of his wand towards the molten lake below and struck it in a wide area. Rah! The dragon screamed in anger and pain as the hyper-cold air clashed with the hyper-hot metal and, more importantly, dragon beneath it. What happens when a super-hot material is rapidly cooled? If you thought it becomes brittle and rigid, then you are correct, and this sudden chemistry lesson was learned by the dragon as well. The frigid magic struck its scorching hide and caused it to crack and peel apart as it was moving a lot, and thus created a nasty-looking wound on its back. Nick's attack did as intended, however, and forced the beast to the surface to keep the molten metal from damaging its exposed flesh. While the dragon was clearly adapted to living in the molten lake, that only really applied if its hide was fully intact, which, thanks to Nick, was no longer the case. 487. Chapter 487. Mistakes have been made, Nick thought as the dragon went from casually trying to murder him to wanting to obliterate him after his attack landed. Dragons were wrathful creatures to begin with, so it came as no surprise to Nick that this one was absolutely livid at the moment. If it wasn't for his advantage in speed, he might really be in trouble, as the beast was quite literally snapping at his heels as it tried to kill him. One thing Nick had noticed, however, was that the beast was also careful not to strike the crystal structure in the center of the lake whenever they got close to it despite its anger. Nick noticed this and took advantage of it to constantly pelt the dragon's exposed flesh with knockout charms that were starting to take hold of it. Nick had to admit that if this was a normal dragon, he would have likely long since had restrained it, but this one was stupidly sturdy and resistant to spells. Nearly 30 full-power knockout spells straight into its body, and all that had accomplished was to make the creature a little drowsy, but still going strong. Fuck it, I tried playing nice time to go for the mean methods. Nick thought in frustration and pointed his wand at the beast. Legilimens. He spoke firmly, and the dragon froze as Nick's mind probe violently smashed into its natural shielding and pierced through them. Dusk had been Nick's legilimency partner for quite some time now, and despite its naturally powerful shields, had also been rapidly improving in them, as it fended Nick off. Compared to defenses like that, this dragon's natural defenses were laughably easy for Nick to bust through. That was when Nick discovered something he hadn't even considered until now. This was not always a dragon. It was deep within the mind space and was suppressed heavily, but there was memories that belonged to something that was obviously not a beast. The Dwmer, Nick realized in astonishment and understanding. He had wondered how this dragon had gotten down here in the first place, and now he knew. It was included in some of the Dwemer's last coherent memories before the beast's mind suppressed it and took control again. In a desperate bid for survival, the Dwemer captured a pack of stone-skull dragons which had lived nearby this area on the surface. Using forbidden life, altering rituals and alchemical solutions, the Dwemer bred the beasts into an entirely new species that could survive for thousands of years while living within the molten metal. The Dwemer then used another forbidden ritual to transfer their mind and soul into an egg in such a way that they could basically control this new body to survive without losing any of their power. The mind and soul fusion was successful, however. It soon became clear that the Dwemer had miscalculated, as they hadn't realized that the minds and souls of the creatures were naturally extremely powerful. The final result was that the mind and soul of the Dwemer was subsumed by the dragons, instead of the other way around, while all the Dwemer's power still went to the newborn beast. Nick sighed at this, while creating false memories in the beast's mind to make it think that it has known him for many, many years, and this was merely one of their spars for supremacy, and not a fight to the death. Fights between dragons for supremacy rarely actually ended in death, since there was no one to rule over if you kill all of them. It was a bit like the hierarchy system of a pride of lions, except that the younger dragons weren't killed off challenging their horde's alphas. Nick left the beast's mind and waited vigilantly as its mind adjusted to his tampering. There was a few ways this could go truthfully, with some being positive and the others being not so positive. Thankfully, the memories were accepted since they didn't clash too heavily with the beast's instincts and true memories. The dragon's gaze changed from hostility to a sort of fond irritation at its loss from the spar. The only reason Nick was even able to make such a change was that thanks to the Dwemer's memories and soul, the dragon technically understood speech. Thus Nick had a way to communicate with it in reality, as it would clash far too much if the dragon only understood body language and roars, yet had memories of conversing with him. This was a unique situation that would only work in this particular scenario alone, and Nick was very much aware of it. 488. Chapter 488. Don't be mistaken into believing that the dragon was anything but a wild force of nature, even after Nick's mental tampering, as the beast by no means would obey him unconditionally. In fact, if he ever showed up in front of it in a poor shape, it was likely to try and usurp his dominant position in the relationship. The same was also true if it felt like it was able to defeat him at any given point in time. Nick, while tempted to dive into the Dwemer's memories to try and steal its knowledge, didn't do so, because he was very much aware that this would disrupt the balance of the dragon and Dwemer's position in the same mind. Just the small glimpse he saw told Nick that the Dwemer was not the sort of being he wanted to truly take control of the dragon's body. It was extremely self-centered, arrogant, and had a clear disregard for all that could be considered forbidden or dark magic. Something like that at Tier 5, with all its knowledge, would almost definitely become a problem in the future, after learning that it was leagues more powerful than most magical beings on the planet. How could the Dwemer not figure that out after Nick read the entries that it had written that stated it had scanned the entire planet already? No. Rather than run the risk of the Dwemer's mind taking over by diving through its memories, Nick chose to leave the dragon in charge for now. Anyways, after the spar, The dragon swam to the shore of the molten lake to start recovering from its wounds while ignoring Nick, since according to it, he was not out of place at all. Nick, on the other hand, flew to the far side of the molten lake and pressed on a stone that looked normal at first glance. After pressing it, however, the rock wall shuddered and rumbled as it opened up to reveal the hidden room that the Dwmer used to store the other members of the dragon species in stasis, alongside all the ritual circles and knowledge it had in a lexicon pedestal. Like old Dwmer, this one simply hated the idea of its knowledge getting lost in case there was an accident or it died, and thus stored all it knew in this pedestal. Of course, this all required a blank lexicon to be inscribed in the first place, and only contained pure knowledge without any experiences or personal findings like the Dwemer's memories held. Luckily for Nick, he had picked up a raw lexicon from the ruins earlier, and thus set it in place, and hit the button to start the inscribing process. Under the scrutiny of his magical senses, Nick understood how the Dwemer did it, and couldn't help but admit that it was ingenious. See, the lexicons were actually not the key to this method of storing information, but rather merely the chosen medium that the Dwemer used for it. The true key was actually the pedestal itself that shot out microscopic lasers of mana that quite literally burned the pre-programmed information into the medium's surface and core. It was super high-concept stuff that the wizarding world probably would never come up with on its own, as it was just so far away from it that it wasn't even funny. And I actually thought that I could replicate this with merely a lexicon. What a joke, Nick thought with a sigh. Soon enough, the lexicon was finished being inscribed, and Nick could see the huge amount of mana contained within the thing. Millions of microscopic runes covered the lexicon and waited for someone to use their mana to read the information they held. Nick didn't do that since he was on a bit of a timeline, and there was clearly not a small amount of information within the lexicon. Instead, Nick stored the lexicon within the realm and turned his attention to the specimens that were kept under stasis via circles that fed off the mana present in the air to power a sort of temporal field. Of course, the Dwemer fucked with time, because absolutely nothing is off limits to these crazy bastards, apparently. Nick complained mentally. Some topics were forbidden for a reason, and time definitely fell on that list strictly because of the horrible things that could happen by messing with it. A good example was how the grandfather paradox solved itself after someone put it to the test with a time turner. A person went back about 4 generations and killed their ancestor, which caused time to decide that the person's entire family, after that point to simply zero, some out of existence, beyond the records outside of time held by the ministry. 489. Chapter 489. Needless to say, Nick was very hesitant to touch the subject, because while he knew for a fact multiverse theory was correct, he would rather not find out what happens if you successfully fuck with your own timeline too much. That said, cancelling the temporal stasis field was a piece of cake, as Nick merely scratched out the mana drawing runes and watched as the circle rapidly depowered as it burned through its fuel. It was interesting to see the small but adult dragons in the cages go from still frame to slowly moving as time resumed for them. Well, small compared to the huge beast out in the molten lake, but still about the size of an elephant, so large in truth. Nick counted, and there was 30 adults, 15 juveniles, and 20 unhatched eggs in total. Really seemed to like the number 5, it seems. He thought with a chuckle after he was done counting the creatures. Unlike the dragon out in the molten lake that had been living freely its entire life, these ones were born and raised under the thumb of the Dwemer, so remained well behaved despite seeing Nick. Going through the creature's memories, Nick discovered why too, as the Dwemer was a cruel master that punished any disobedience harshly and rewarded obedience lightly. The punishments were agonizing torture, and the rewards were slightly more or better food and the privilege to breed. Nick was disgusted by this, and then released the creatures from their cages and into the molten lake after placing himself firmly as their alpha. The huge dragon in the lake was not bothered at all by this, as the new additions to the environment immediately submitted to it. The eggs, however, were a different story for Nick, as he stored them in his realm. Hagrid will likely be thrilled to take care of them until they hatch, but I'll have to check with Dumbledore if that will be all right first. If nothing else, these little ones will help set up a stable population of this species. Nick thought after he stored the eggs away. Despite being an engineered species, by the Dwmer, the dragons were originally part of a species that truly existed, but had gone extinct from overhunting, so most magizoologists would be thrilled to see them return in some way. Nick obviously knew that publicly coming out and saying that he discovered them wouldn't sit well with the Order, since it would definitely draw attention to them again, as those in the know would seek them out to learn where Nick found the dragons. This was where Dumbledore came into play, as the old man could go on a short trip without anyone knowing and come back while saying that he discovered the species. The really tricky part was getting a decent-sized population set up and removing them from the molten lake and into the original habitat. There was no way in hell Nick was going to let anyone near the Dwemer ruin, and even less of a chance the molten lake with the crystal he suspected contained a guard. It doesn't even matter that the huge dragon could fend off most wizards easily, as if they somehow caused the seal on the crystal to come undone, the guard within is likely to be pissed from basically being killed by curious ants, as there was no way a guard could survive for long with the current mana levels of the world. So moving the dragons to a new place, and then having them be, accidentally, discovered by Dumbledore was the best option. Nick was satisfied with his haul on this trip, and left the hidden room behind him after emptying it of everything he was interested in. Floating about the molten lake, Nick approached the crystal, which got him watched closely by the huge dragon resting on the molten lake shore. Nick ignored that, however, as he closed his eyes and focused on his magical senses as he closely observed the crystal. It was hard to notice, but the longer he observed, the more horrified he was at what he found. Uncountable number of runes were all layered on top of each other and through each other in a massive spell formation that had solidified around something of immense power to stop the effects of time on it until a condition was fulfilled. The real horror, however, came from the discovery that the molten lake was created exclusively from the minute amounts of the immense power's mana that leaked. In simple terms, the metal was created out of pure energy in defiance of the laws of reality on accident. Is this the true meaning of divinity, to create matter from nothing by simply existing? Nick pondered in shock. 490. Chapter 490. Nick had always assumed that the gods like Zeus were basically just massively upgraded forms of wizards, but this was now proven to be massively incorrect. Not only incorrect, but a huge underestimation as well. I thought I was making good progress to being able to fend off Zeus, but how the hell am I supposed to fight something like this? Nick panicked mentally as the realization set in that he was very far from even being a threat to Zeus. Calm yourself. No good will come of panic. You could not have known of this aspect until now, so you could not plan around it. Now you can. Celebrimbor counseled wisely. It should not be forgotten that despite being most well known as a smith, Celebrimbor was a warrior and a tactician for long before he even picked up a hammer. A damn good one as well, to the point it was the literal second thing that history remembered him for. Nick was well aware of this fact himself, which let him calm down greatly after the elf spoke. The key points in any conflict is information, skill, and preparations. If you have enough time to gather these in plenty, then no foe can truly defeat you without exceeding you in the same. The elf lord said seriously. What plan can I even make in the face of this, though? The most dangerous thing I can create is rendered moot in the face of this power. Nick asked, heavily demoralized. While it is true that you cannot make adequate preparations to counter your foe at this point, that is no reason to believe you cannot in the future. Need I remind you that your growth in power has been rapid and strong? Celebrimbor spoke firmly. That knowledge helped Nick to fully calm himself and focus on trying to gather information about divinity from the crystal. It was a slow process, as all he studied was the tiny amounts of mana that was released from the crystal before they turned into metal. Though from what Nick did learn over the next few days before he had no choice, but to return to Hogwarts, even calling it mana, was wrong. The basic structure of the energy was the same, but it was fundamentally different from the stuff Nick had come to accept as a part of his everyday life. It was hard to describe for Nick, as while it confirmed a few of his theories about what the higher tiers of power were like, it left him with many more questions than answered. For example, the mana was qualitatively superior than anything Nick could have even considered possible, like it had been broken down into its purest form before strengthened many-fold to almost be an entirely different type of energy. Even stranger was that the energy seemed to have innate properties to itself that didn't seem unnatural at all, but like they were meant to be there. This was what caused the energy to turn into metal from what Nick could tell, but besides a theory that this was something innate to divinity, Nick had no clue what he was even looking at. This left him confused and frustrated when he finally returned to Hogwarts the day before the students were due to come back. "Bloody hell, mate. Where have you been this whole time?" "I looked all over the castle but couldn't find you at all," Ron questioned curiously after Nick went to dinner. Iceland had a bit of an errand to take care of, there is all," Nick said casually. Ron and the rest of the people at the table listening to the conversation all had dumbfounded looks. "Buddy, pal, greatest ringmaker ever, how in Merlin's name did you even get to Iceland and back in less than a week?" Fred asked with overflowing curiosity. The rest of the people listening to the conversation were also dying to learn this as well. "It wasn't even that hard, really. Only took about an hour to get there by flight for me," Nick said with a shrug. "You had to be going faster than sound to get there in less than an hour," LeJordan exclaimed in shock. Contrary to popular opinion, Gryffindor students weren't actually stupid, and Lee Jordan was especially outstanding in terms of mental acumen, and had easily figured out the distance between here and Iceland, and by extension how fast you would need to go to get there in under an hour. Nick wasn't even surprised about it, as the boy had to be fast thinking to accurately keep up with a Quidditch and Blitz Ball game, given the amount of things going on at once during one. 491. Chapter 491. "That is correct, yes," Nick said, nodding in agreement. "How did you even get a broom to fly that fast? No, wait. Why did you get one to go that fast?" Lee asked curiously. "First, I didn't use a broom. Second, does it matter all that much? Like, I very much doubt any of you are going to make a similar trip anytime soon, and even if you were, there are better methods anyways, like continental portkeys," Nick said bluntly. Everyone went silent as they realized he had a point, as it really was unlikely that they needed to leave the country anytime soon, and that portkeys were in fact a better method. "Wait a sec, did you say you didn't use a broom?" Seamus asked after noticing this detail. "That is what I said, yes. Why?" Nick said casually. "Please tell me you didn't use my dad's car," Ron said with a look of panic. Nick scoffed. That piece of junk was taken by the ministry, and even if it wasn't, it was horribly inefficient and sloppily enchanted, which made sense considering your dad was merely tinkering with it to begin with. "No, I merely enchanted a piece of equipment to allow me to fly without the constraints of a broom," he explained honestly. It didn't matter if he told them about this enchantment, as unless he chose to sell it publicly, the information was nearly useless to know. "Nick can fly. Cool, can you?" "No." Then how the hell is knowing it useful at all? Besides making people jealous, knowing that Nick didn't need a broom to fly served no real purpose. Everyone also realized this after the twins asked for such an enchanted object, and Nick denied them without any hesitation. Once it became clear that Nick wasn't going to share his flight enchantment, the conversation shifted to what Nick went to Iceland for. All he told them was that he had read about something that was found and hidden away there in the past, and he decided to go treasure hunting for it while he had the time. This was entirely true, even if he left out a few key details that would have made it clear that this was no simple matter. When asked what he found, Nick refused to answer and left it up to their imaginations, after merely stating that it was a profitable trip. He wasn't lying either, as merely the drones he had recovered would have proven valuable and worthwhile for the trip, much less everything else he found as well. A bunch of high-potential dragon eggs, the knowledge of the Dwmer recorded on the lexicon, and extremely valuable data regarding divinity, not to mention the vast amount of powerful metal he had gotten, while he was there, made the entire trip extremely profitable. Still, despite that, Nick chose to immediately vanish from the school instead of relaxing, as he now knew roughly how large a gap he had to cover in order to face Zeus was. Well, it wasn't exactly accurate to say. He vanished from the school, so much as went to a part of it that no one else was aware of in the form of Slytherin's library. Nick was about halfway done with the library, and he wanted to finish the rest as soon as possible so he could begin deciphering the lexicon's knowledge, while he improved his power via rituals and elixirs. The funny part was that Nick knew of one such ritual that would likely cause his power to instantly jump many tiers at once, but like all such things came with a very high price. The ritual of maturation was a dreadful thing that was created by wizards of old in order to accelerate the physical and magical maturation of a young wizard, thus skipping the growth period entirely. This sounded good at first glance, until you understood the price needed to achieve such a thing. First was obviously that the body and magic might mature, but the mind and soul did not, thus creating a child in an adult body. The second issue, however, was that one needed to sacrifice twice the time it would have normally been for this maturation in terms of lifespan. To simplify, if you matured the child, it was used on the full 7-year growth period. That child instead loses 14 years off their total lifespan. For Nick, this isn't a problem since his lifespan is endless, as elves stop aging after reaching maturity, unless they choose otherwise. No, the issue for him comes in the form of stunted potential, as whatever gains he would have gotten through natural maturity beyond his natural magic growth would be rendered null, as he obviously wouldn't have them since he skipped years of maturation. 492. Chapter 492. This is not to say Nick wouldn't grow stupidly powerful through the ritual, but that his skill and knowledge would be massively out of sync with it, which would hold him back for likely even longer than if he studied and matured normally. The final drawback, however, was the one that had Nick classify the ritual as an absolute final resort type deal. To put it simply, this ritual corrupts the soul due to how against nature it is, which was a huge problem for Nick. He used his soul for nearly every facet of the Celebrimber style, and even required soul purity to use ballad enchantments to their fullest potential. With this understood, Nick would never utilize this ritual unless he felt like the power boost was his only course of action. He was well aware that his natural maturation alone would likely place him at tier 5, or maybe even 6, due to the extreme rate of growth it had, so he wasn't too worried about becoming powerful, as in time it was practically guaranteed. What he wanted was to reach his full potential, however, so despite having great power as a future guarantee, he sought ways to truly squeeze out every ounce of bonus growth he could before he matured, and his magical growth slowed to a snail's pace. The first half of Slytherin's library was written about his formative years and early adulthood, so lacked any grand feats of magic or powerful spellwork. Nick could easily see the transition as he memorized the contents of the library from simple to complex magical knowledge. Entire tomes on metaphysical phenomena and medical magics that would make any modern mediwitch faint in shock. Salazar was thorough in every single detail of his life as far as Nick could see from his reading, until one historically important event, meeting Godric Gryffindor. An interesting fact that most ignore is that the founders' last names were specifically chosen by the founders themselves, and that they either lacked any last name or forsook the one they had originally for their chosen one. Salazar, for example, came from the noble name of Bohun, but forsook it for Slytherin due to how noble he considered snakes. The other founders had chosen similarly as him, with the exception of Hufflepuff, that was apparently a joke name by Helga that stuck. Ironically, the Salazar and Godric didn't meet under the best of conditions, originally, but rather were competing over the contents of an ancient wizard's tomb. Even Slytherin himself made no attempt to sugar-coat the situation as pleasant, but directly stated that it was an outright magical slugfest that both men walked away from in horrible condition. Cheap tricks and terrible curses from Slytherin, seeking to quickly end the battle, and powerful blunt force charms and transfigurations from Gryffindor that sought supremacy through pure power clashed to destructive and terrible effect. Salazar lost this particular bout and needed to flee miserably, though not before leaving a large amount of painful-sounding curses on Godric. The two, funnily enough, couldn't seem to stay away from each other as they met, and clashed many more times after that with mixed results, as sometimes Salazar won and sometimes Godric did. Still through this, they developed an odd sort of respect and eventually straight-up friendship. Along the way, Rowena and Helga joined the group as they sought powerful and reliable allies, until under the suggestion of Helga and Godric Hogwarts was founded to end the era of wandering wizards and dark magic. Nick learned a great many things over the next 2 months after he dropped out of enchanting, since he had patched up his skewed understanding of the topic. This only left him with divination, so he only attended a single class a week before devoting the rest of his time to Slytherin's library. Thanks to this, Nick finally finished it up right at the 28th of February. A day later, the abomination finally made land fall once again, and it was time to see if the space looping trap would work. Nick was summoned to Dumbledore's office when the time came, and the old goat had out a large crystal ball that Nick immediately spotted contained an enchantment to show the surrounding of another crystal ball wherever it may be. "If you are here, then, how will the trap be sprung?" Nick asked with a frown. "Nico has graciously volunteered to stay at the edge of the formation to complete it and fuel it once the creature enters the center of it. Here is the hagstone box you asked for, by the way," the old man said seriously, as he brought up a small grey jewelry box from his robe's inner pocket. 493. Chapter 493. The creature was boiling in anger by the time it finally landed on the shore, as it cut a sorry figure with nearly no muscles and dark bags under its sun-burnt skin. Without a steady source of magic to feed off of the creature, had resorted to self-consumption, as well as the sporadic meal in the form of foolish magical creatures that it ran across to maintain its existence. This caused the creature to truly appear like a walking skeleton, with dark, cracked skin stretched over it and sunken eyes that radiated madness and wrath. The witch or wizard holding the viewing orb from the sky allowed Nick to see this grotesque scene through the ball in Dumbledore's office. "Honestly, I am pretty sure it's close to death already, so maybe just shooting it would finish it off," Nick said with a frown. Something about this bothered him, like it was just way too easy for the level of danger the creature should hold. Indeed, though I admit the Ministry has not helped the matter for the creature by diverting most magical beast away from its path, Dumbledore said calmly. "Ah, I see. So that's why it seems too easy. The creature has been starved more than I expected thanks to the Ministry's efforts," Nick said while nodding in understanding. "Observe, it's starting," Dumbledore said firmly, and they both observed the ball intensely. The view panned out, and for a long distance away they could see several stones light up, and a silvery-looking barrier spread out from each stone connecting until it formed a massive dome with the creature in the center. The dome then turned transparent, and from within it an odd scene was playing out. The creature seemed to feel that something wrong as it shot forward inhumanly fast, only to look like it lagged for a moment before appearing on the opposite side of the dome it was just at. It apparently didn't realize that this happened immediately and kept sprinting forward only to end up opposite the previous location again. "It hasn't panicked yet, so we don't know if the trap will hold quite yet, but it looks promising," Nick said honestly, and Dumbledore nodded. Soon, however, the abomination figured out what was happening and opened its mouth in what appeared to be a horrible wail. A wave of pure destruction radiated from the creature in all directions, evaporating everything from stone to the very air itself, as nothing was spared. Thankfully, the trap managed to contain this power and even forced the creature to cease its attack as the spatial loop sent the attack back at it. Once the bright magic vanished, Nick could see that all that was left was a perfectly smooth bowl-shaped hole with the creature falling infinitely from the top of the dome to the bottom before falling from the sky again. The creature flailed desperately and sent all manner of attacks flying as it fell before, in the end, collapsing in on itself as its magic cannibalized its very existence. It was a slow and gruesome end to witness, and neither Nick or Dumbledore dared to look away, since they were the ones that set this in motion, and thus were determined to witness it to the finish. "Leave the formation up for a month before lowering it. Keep the box, as I will clearly not need it," Nick said seriously before leaving the office deep in thought. During this event, he He had witnessed several unique and unknown forms of magic from the abomination, and he wished to learn what they were and how they were done. Most important was the wave of pure destruction that seemed to erase matter in a stable manner, that seemed directly to be the antithesis to divine mana that created matter from nothing. Nick knew that the abomination likely used it instinctually and didn't understand what it was doing, but it still inspired him. He didn't know what it was called or even what the requirements to use were, but Nick did know that he wanted it. He was hopeful that it would allow him to counter divine mana to a degree. Generally, from what Nick could tell, magic was extremely balanced, in that typically the counter to something was usually on the same level it was, but there were a few exceptions. The most well-known was the Fiendfire curse that could be countered with magical intent in a Protego shield. The evil flame seeks to devour everything, and yet if sealed within a barrier infused with the wizard's willpower, it is stopped somehow despite clearly being higher grade. 494. Chapter 494. Nick wasted no time at all searching the system for any book on the subject of whatever the abomination used, but found only a single work on it that was way out of his price range at a whopping 500 million points. Nick was not surprised at the price, or that the knowledge was so rare either, as it was obviously extremely high tier, and also the sort of thing no one in their right mind would try and learn. From what Nick could tell, the magic was basically pure destruction given form to the point of erasing matter itself. Something like that definitely couldn't be controlled with any real level of precision, meaning it only took a split-second mistake to see yourself erased from existence. With a sigh, Nick closed out the system, since it was pointless to keep looking at the tome on the subject if he couldn't afford it. Instead, he headed to the library to see if he could find the information on the blood curse that the Greengrass family suffered from. First, he checked the ancient section to see if it was there, and only after a few hours searching, he found what he was looking for. It turned out that Nick's theory about the curse not originally being meant to be a curse was correct, as according to the information he found, the original creator noticed the steadily decreasing power of the pureblood bloodlines and wanted to forcefully correct this problem. And this is why false assumptions are the bane of people's attempts. Nick thought, with a disapproving look at the method behind the person's spellwork. The person assumed that the key to the bloodline's power was in fact within the blood, which was obviously incorrect. Nick was well aware that the bloodline's mirror set the body up to be able to host the power inherited, but after that point, the blood in one's body had little to do with it anymore. The magic circuits were where the true key to that power was, and the reason for the decreasing power of the purebloods was because of their generationally atrophying circuits, as they tried to coast off their ancestors' glory and effort without any themselves. Besides the false assumption, though the creator of the curse correctly did their work, and the curse did affect one's bloodline in a small, but otherwise generally positive way. The issue came in the form of the fact that the magic was incorrectly founded and thus horribly flawed, which caused the spell to turn from a blessing to a powerful hereditary curse. There was no more information after that point, besides a warning to never try and use this spell on yourself, as it will only kill you instead. Considering the sudden change, in handwriting I assume that the end was written by the creator's apprentice or relative, Nick thought while shaking his head. It was pretty easy to understand why that was the case too, since the creator likely got overzealous and used the spell on themselves. Well, at least it is easy to fix now that I know this information. You just need to channel the curse from the blood to the magical core so that it actually does what it was intended to. Nick thought with an odd expression. Despite a plethora of mediwitches trying to crack the Greengrass curse, none had succeeded now, despite the solution being very simple to accomplish. To be fair to them, though, they all operated off the premise that the curse was entirely meant to be a negative thing, like most curses, which stopped them from making progress on it, ironically. Till now, all they could do was treat the symptoms of the curse to extend the bearer's life and try and make them more comfortable before the curse eventually claimed them. Time to give this method to Madame Pomfrey, then, Nick thought as he left the library. He quickly placed a powerful disillusionment charm on himself, as well as a notice me not charm to keep the perceptive mediwitch from finding him as he approached the hospital wing. Nick found that he actually had perfect timing as he spotted Astoria leaving the place feebly. Nick saw the curse flaring up within her at this point and secretly pulsed a reverse magical wave to forcefully calm it down as she passed by him. Astoria didn't notice this, but clearly felt better as her footsteps became more stable. Nick nodded satisfied with this and stealthily slipped into the hospital wing while avoiding the detection wards placed at the entrance. He knew that they were there not to detect trespassers, but to inform Madame Pomfrey of incoming patients. 495. Chapter 495. The elderly Mediwitch in question was cleaning up with a depressed expression that Nick could understand. To someone that has dedicated their life to healing others, being helpless to stop an illness was a disheartening thing. Luckily, Nick was here to save the day this time, and he secretly infiltrated the Mediwitch's mind before leaving the information she needed with a small nudge so that she thinks she figured out the issue. Nick watched as her face lit up in realization once the implanted knowledge showed up as a thought, and she hurriedly chased after Astoria once she double-checked to see if it was even a viable possibility. Well, it looks like my work here is done, Nick thought with a smile before leaving the area stealthily. About 5 days later, the matter blew up dramatically as the Greengrass family made a public announcement about being cured of their blood curse thanks to Madame Pomfrey. Apparently the cure put Daphne in such a good mood that she was all smiles for several days, much to the discomfort of many. She had a bit of a reputation as a cold person, so seeing her smiling so much threw quite a few off. The best part in Nick's opinion was that she clearly didn't suspect him at all to be behind the matter. That didn't mean no one else did, though, as the day before the announcement was made, Madame Pomfrey had visited the headmaster's office. "Ah, Poppy, what brings you this evening?" Dumbledore asked in a friendly manner. "It's about this whole blood curse business, Albus," Madame Pomfrey said seriously. "Is there something wrong with the cure you devised?" Dumbledore asked, concerned. She shook her head. "No, the cure itself works splendidly. The problem is the source of the cure," she stated honestly. "What do you mean?" Dumbledore asked, confused. Madame Pomfrey sighed. "After thinking over it a lot, I have reason to believe that it was not my own idea, but one planted in my mind," she said sternly. Dumbledore frowned. "Is there any evidence to support this theory?" he asked, and she nodded. "Whoever did it was skilled at the mind art beyond anything I have ever seen, but clearly didn't realize that I had an extra set of defenses that did not function the same as the shields, but rather worked to find any foreign magical signatures attached to memories, since tampering always leaves a trace of it behind," she explained seriously. "But if this is true, then why would they go so far to give you the cure for that specific curse, and not look at your memories?" Dumbledore asked, confused. They both knew that her knowledge was extremely precious, so the fact someone would secretly infiltrate her mind and not look at them, but rather just leave behind knowledge instead, was hard to understand. "I have been asking myself that same question this entire time, and I have a theory that explains it, but is confusing as well. I believe whoever did this didn't want anyone to know it was them and used me as a scapegoat in this matter," Madame Pomfrey said honestly. Dumbledore's eyes widened before he smiled and chuckled. "I believe I have an idea as to who it was and why it was done like this. You can accept the credit freely and let your mind be at ease, as they likely meant well in this case," he said reassuringly, and Madame Pomfrey sighed in relief and chose to drop the matter. "I hope you know what you are doing, Nick," the old wizard thought as Madame Pomfrey left his office. He was not as ignorant to the things Nick was studying as Nick thought, and was likely the only person in the world truly aware of just how monstrously ahead of his peers Nick was. He had after all been monitoring the parts of the library Nick frequented through the wards there, and thus had long figured out about Nick's gift of language. Dumbledore did not know what it was that drove Nick to seek improvement so fervently, but he hoped that, when he reaches the point he seeks, that he doesn't lose touch with the rest of the world like so many do. Nick, of course, wasn't aware of any of this, and even if he was, it wouldn't bother him at all, as by this point he held the knowledge of a Tier 4 or new Tier 5. His skill at deploying that knowledge was also rapidly improving, as he was confident to be able to defeat even high Tier 3s like Snape and Helena without much issue if it came to it. All the while he drew closer and closer to true immortality as he deciphered more and more of the Daedric book. 496. Chapter 496. Summer break was rapidly approaching, and Nick wanted to completely prepare for his binding of the realm before it arrived, so he chose to leave the lexicon's knowledge on hold until he did. This wasn't to say that Nick didn't take a couple days to relax or often hung out with his friends that were cramming for the upcoming exams. No, like this, he said while helping Ron with the practical portion of the charms practice. Merely watching someone perform something was not enough for the redhead to pick it up, so Nick was moving the boy's wand hand so he could feel what he needed to do instead. Nick had long since figured out that Ron was far from untalented, but due to the fact he couldn't learn in the standard way, he regularly underperformed. Teaching him in this much more hands-on way let the redhead improve rapidly. Is this correct? Tracy asked as she showed Nick a runic sentence since she was studying for her runes exam. This part here should be like this, actually, Nick said as he tapped on the paper with his finger, causing another very similar runic sentence to appear on it with notes and arrows pointing out the differences. This was actually one of the greatest gains Nick had gotten from Slytherin's library, wandless magic. Towards the end of the library, the founder had a few tomes on his experiences in the use of magic without a wand, alongside his theories on why it was supposed to be so difficult. Basically, wizards who use wands have trained their bodies to that method. Thus, when they start trying to use magic wandlessly, it feels unnatural, and so they struggle to overcome this hurdle. Slytherin also postulated that wandless magic had different rules than magic with a wand, so it was inefficient as the wizard forces it with what they knew to work with wands. The final theory was that it depended on the purity of one's magic and the strength of one's soul that determined how easy it was to use the stuff. After attempting wandless casting, following the founder's method, Nick felt rather irritated because it was practically second nature to him. He knew why too, as in terms of purity of mana and strength of soul, he was monstrously high in both. Even further, he had experience in wandless casting due to his elemental bloodline and his Animagus abilities. There was still a bit of trouble adapting his skill in magic to a wandless version, and of course, there was a steep drop in power behind each spell he cast wandlessly due to how inefficient it was, but only to about the level of the average Hogwarts graduate, which was more than adequate for most things. The only exception to this was when he used transfiguration magic, as his supreme talent in the art now made him more dangerous than ever, as he only needed a thought to shift his surroundings to his will. Hey, just how far ahead of us are you anyways? Tracy asked after seeing the wandless spell. In pure knowledge a bit under Dumbledore, and in terms of skill about the same level as McGonagall and Snape. To be fair, though, I am a bit of a workaholic with too much free time to constantly push my knowledge and skill forward. Nick answered after thinking about it for a moment. Way to make us feel like baggage. Harry joked, and everyone laughed. Nick shrugged, like I said, too much free time. He said in mock helplessness, Still, it's hard to believe you are the same age as most of us. Daphne said, and everyone nodded in agreement. I'm just built different, I guess. Nick said, not really bothered by the difference in ability between him and his friends. After all, he didn't become friends with them for their ability to keep up with him, but rather because as individuals he can relax around them and just generally vibe with their personalities, after a bit of personal growth on their parts, of course. Ron is no longer the jealous, ignorant idiot he was at the beginning. Hermione is a much more personable person, and actually pretty chill most of the time now, and even Luna is usually all smiles, and generally in a good mood. Daphne and Tracy never really needed personal growth, but rather a slight change in situations to really open up. All in all, the group just sort of clicked together around Nick as its center, which he was fine with. The best part in his opinion was that in many ways each and every one of his chosen friends was way ahead of the rest of their peers, just by the benefits of associating with him on a regular basis. 497. Chapter 497. The elder at the Order of the Golden Sands had been in a poor mood for quite some time now. It was hard not to be when the reports from the spy within Hogwarts all but confirmed that Nick was no longer someone they could easily erase. Even more, the person that was working on cracking the ward around the island had seemingly vanished from the face of the planet. Curse that woman for ever giving birth to this brat. The elder thought as he signed off on the death of that person after the grace period ended. Things had been going downhill ever since Nick was born, as due to who his father was, the entire order scorned his mother for the first 10 years of his life. The woman was no simple character, however, and actively worked against the order's interests, as a result causing irreparable damage to it by destroying valuable resources in such a manner no one could figure out the culprit. Even then, the woman was little more than a nuisance, as she never crossed the line about what she could or could not do. That was until the exile happened, that is. Through an ancient ritual, Nick was tested on his talent and potential, only to be found a squib. As per the Order's long-held tradition, the brat was mind wiped about everything related to the Order and exiled to the Muggle world to fend for himself. This proved to be the final straw for the woman who, in her fury, destroyed every tome of knowledge collected over the last 5 centuries, forcing the Order to execute her. But at that point, it was already too late, and the Elder could easily foresee the Order's decline, as their foundation had been almost entirely destroyed. The Elder had treated the brat like all squids and ignored his existence until he showed up at Hogwarts 3 years ago. The spy at the school couldn't believe it and reported the matter, but the Elder, in his hubris, ignored it as a fluke of the ritual, since the brat couldn't be talented or anything right. Oh, how reality just loved to prove him wrong, as the boy showed himself to be gifted to an extreme degree. A brand new method of enchantment and monstrous pace of learning magic were shown brilliantly to the world. Then it happened, and Dumbledore meddled with the brat's past and exposed the fact that the Ravenclaw bloodline still existed. Even after all this, however, the brat was merely an eyesore to the Elder, but not something that required him to admit his folly. That changed when the brat started to do increasingly concerning feats of magic that were seen on a global scale, such as creating a way to give ghosts physical bodies. Not to say him freeing Black from Azkaban and getting Pettigrew executed wasn't important, but merely that he got no public credit for it, really. Still, while a little bit of attention was getting drawn to the Order from this stuff, it was not enough to approach the brat yet. That changed when he publicly showed off that horrid familiar of his that, by all reports, was an equally monstrous existence in a beauty pageant of all things. Those that recognized the boy's features as belonging to his mother and uncle from past experiences started to question the Order about their intentions by having such a prodigy standing out in the public. Showing the records of the boy's exile managed to get these people to back off, but the Elder knew the brat needed to be curbed soon, as he was starting to become a problem for the Order. Unfortunately, the spy at Hogwarts couldn't get to much information on the brat due to his secretive nature, so when that whole debacle with the Sturm vampire clan happened, the vampires hit the Order hard. Even showing the boy's exile record only placated the leeches slightly, but not enough to stop them from interfering with the Order's operations. That was the last straw that broke the camel's back, and the Elder declared a hunt on the brat's head. As it was obvious at this point, the brat was far more powerful than expected and handedly chased off his uncle from that island while fatally injuring him upon escape. The Elder was furious at being so heavily acknowledged, as at fault for allowing the brat to grow to such a degree. For the first time in a long time, the Order was forced to admit their helplessness and offered the brat an ultimatum-type bargain. In truth, the Elder knew it was not something that they could make good on if the brat chose to ignore it, as he was now backed by enough influential and powerful people that the Order would be crushed like a bug if the brat was truly targeted by them. 498. Chapter 498. It was a bluff to try and preserve the Order's prestige, and like all good bluffs, the only one aware of it was the Elder that set it up to begin with. It was done in such a way as well that it was an extremely convincing one, as well as even Dumbledore believed it. On the other side of the world, however, there was another man with 2 different colored eyes that had seen it with his own seer abilities and scoffed at it. That wasn't to say Grindelwald couldn't appreciate the depth of the bluff, merely that he knew how pointless it was. He had observed much of Nick's actions long before he ever even thought of them using his seer powers, and had long since deduced the boy's personality. Nick was fairly peaceful, all things considered, as he rarely ever actively sought someone out to harm them, but instead waited for his enemies to come to him before destroying them. If an animal needed to be chosen to represent him, then Grindelwald would say Nick was much like a phoenix or thunderbird in attitude. He was slow to anger and proud of all he had, but was a force to be reckoned with if angered to violence. As such, Grindelwald thought it only fitting that the boy's Animagus form be the offspring of both that was nobler than any other bird. If anything, though Grindelwald was apologetic towards Nick and those he sacrificed for his grand ritual. For Nick it was because he knew what he would unleash upon the earth by doing this, but believed it was the best option for wizarding kind despite this. For his victims, it was because he made a point to learn the fate of all he sacrificed should he not have, and thus was truly sorry for ripping that future away from them, for the greater good. None of this mattered to Nick, however, as he was focusing heavily on digesting the information within the Daedric book. One might ask how it could take so long to read a book, but there was a difference between understanding the contents and merely reading the words written. It was a bit like a cookbook full of recipes when you didn't know what the ingredients, units of measurement, and techniques for the recipes were. Sure, you could still read and even memorize the recipes themselves, but you couldn't make any of them despite that. What Nick was doing was slowly learning what the terms used in the book meant and slowly piecing together all the details into usable form as a result. This was a slow process, but one that he was more than willing to subject himself to, because the reward was well worth it. With the abomination dead and gone, and the order silent, Nick finally had peace to just strive towards his goals, as he himself had nothing pressing to worry about. This didn't mean that nothing happened, as he steadily drew closer to fully understanding the contents of the Daedric book, however. In fact, the exact opposite was true, as Harry had unknowingly crossed into Tier 1, which was to say his mana quantity had reached the same level as the average Hogwarts graduate. His skill was nowhere near that point, though, but Nick expected as much, since while talented, Harry simply didn't have the drive to push himself to the fullest. He had no reason to, as Voldemort was dead, and as far as he was aware, that was the only thing that was really his problem to deal with. Nick agreed that was actually true for the most part, since Grindelwald was technically not an issue, while the returning guards were firmly his own problem to solve, with help, of course. Another interesting thing that happened was that Nick had been invited by Vlad and the royal vampires to a ball held on Beltane. It was the only time they were all present at the same location at once, and while that might seem like a vampire hunter's wet dream, it very much wasn't. 1 or 2 royal vampires could be handled by a skilled hunter, but 1 or 200. Not a snowball's chance in hell would that go well for the hunters. Nick wasn't the only non-vampire invited to the ball either, as quite a few others were likely to be there as well. The Flammels, various old wizards from around the world, and there was even a possibility of Grindelwald himself being there, since the man was on good terms with Vlad. Nick figured he would go either way simply because it was a good opportunity to relax and expand his network of contacts for the future. 499. Chapter 499. Nick had also gotten a new mission that he found rather pointless from the system as well during this period of peace. Mission conditions established. Description: your ambitions and unique existence have driven you to seek hegemony through realm lordship, and you are on the edge of stepping onto this treacherous and difficult path. Objectives: bind a realm to yourself, discard your physical form to be truly reborn, optional. Perfect your realm's incomplete laws before the start of the next school year, optional. Rewards: Lord's Presence, ability, Waters of the Soul book, optional. Optional. Status: incomplete. While Nick could appreciate the system approving his chosen path, it seemed a bit over the top to just get handouts for doing what he planned anyways. The first optional objective was also entirely pointless to have as well because it was off the table. Nick's body was very much still needed in order to fully maximize his growth, so discarding it was out of the question. He knew for a fact that when he eventually did lose his body, and was reborn from the waters of his realm, the form he will take is unlikely to look human at all. Deidre always have inhuman features that give away their nature, and Nick doubted that his form would be much different. One had to keep in mind that despite being mostly elf in essence, he also had Daedric and celestial bird parts as well that would no doubt show up on his reborn form. With that understood, Nick had no intention of discarding his body until he had no choice, or he grew so powerful that he no longer needed to maintain the charade of him being human, which was admittedly approaching rapidly as his power grew by the day. By his calculations, around his 6th year, in fact, was when he should reach high tier 4 at the very least. The truth of the matter was that Nick wasn't entirely sure how powerful he would be by that point, as he assumed that Grindelwald's ritual will have been completed by then, and he won't have an upper ceiling of power anymore. Speaking of upper ceilings of power, Nick had a slight issue with a ritual he found in Slytherin's library towards the end of it. This ritual in particular was designed by Salazar, but had never been used as he didn't find any of his descendants at that time worthy of it, and he was far too old to do it himself. He referred to it as the True Path ceremony, and it was a ritual set over 7 days. Well, that wasn't entirely accurate, as to be correct, it was 7 different rituals that were done one day after the last. Salazar explained in his tomes on the subject that there was a certain amount of time that the magic of a ritual needed to set in a permanent manner within a body. Using an uncomfortable amount of experiments, he figured out that it was usually between 20 and 70 hours on average. The True Path ceremony used this to create a qualitative improvement effect by stacking effects together from rituals before the magic could set in place. The final result was a full overhauling of one's magical system from the core to the bloodline abilities. The catch was that skipping a single ritual in the set cripples the magic of the one undergoing it, and that only those still maturing magically could undergo the ceremony. Now one would assume that this would be a perfect ritual for Nick to undergo so long as he modified it for his own personal use, but that was where the issue came up. The ingredients for the ritual have long since gone extinct as far as everyone knew, and there was a lot of ingredients needed. Nick knew he could get some of these through the royal vampires, who most likely had a few in storage. But for others, he had no clue how he would get them save a single dreadful idea, temporal manipulation. In his first year, when he was dumb and ignorant of what that entailed, Nick fantasized about owning a vast garden with extinct ingredients plucked from just before they would have been lost originally. At this point, however, he knew just how insane that actually was to do, as he not only needed to be able to pinpoint the exact ingredient at the exact time it would have been destroyed, but he also needed to cancel the time-slip effect that happened when something moved from the past to the future. Time always sought to uphold its authority, so when some arrogant wizard tries to go back in time, it causes them to experience all the time from when they went back to the present at once, which meant an inconsequential few hours to a full-blown amount of centuries in an instant, hence the name Timeslip. 500, Chapter 500. Ironically, Nick wasn't worried about being affected by timeslipping himself. As an elf, his lifespan was pretty much infinite, but the problem came in the form of the ingredients as well as what effect it would have on him. Obviously, the ingredients would crumble away and render the trip pointless, but even further, Nick himself would end up fully matured, which would also render the trip pointless, as only someone with maturing magic could undergo the ceremony. Nick had easily thought of a few possible ideas that might work to fix these problems, but each one was horribly difficult. For example, he could rebuild the drones he had gotten from the Dwmer ruin, as time had little effect on the things while they were active, thus meaning the time-slipping wouldn't cause any trouble for them. At that point, he merely needed to find a way to isolate and purge the temporal energies that would try and affect the ingredients the drones would collect for him, and he would be able to collect whatever he wanted from history without issue. It should be obvious, however, if he had such a mastery of time magic, then he wouldn't have this issue to begin with, and gaining that sort of mastery was no easy feat. In fact, doing so was probably more difficult than creating a whole new realm once again. The thing about realm creation, from what Nick could see, was that you don't need much mastery over the fundamental forces of one, such as time and space. Rather, you actually only need a tiny amount of each of these forces' power to be combined correctly in order to create an incomplete realm like what Nick currently had. From there, it is merely a matter of adding more and more of these forces' power to the realm to expand it and complete it into a full world. The fact was that there was no real need for mastery of these forces in order to create a realm, but merely resources. On the flip side, however, if one wanted to create an entire world instantly, then mastery was required to do so. That was how Celebrimbo's world had been born after all, as the Aina and Valor were born with absolute mastery of their respective forces and elements that sang the song of creation that fused that mastery into a full-blown world from the start. In fact, these beings could be considered gods that were born with these domains innately and used them to create that world. For one of them to manipulate the forces of time, should they have that domain, would be easy, but Nick was no god, nor did he possess any inkling of that domain. It was ironically very easy to determine what domains one was generally attuned to just by seeing what sort of magics they are most talented at. Nick's domains, for example, would be crafting, souls, fire, lightning, weather, birds, languages, and magic. To clarify, having a domain of magic didn't refer to magic in general, but rather magical energy or mana. All in all, Nick's domains were varied and wide-reaching, but had very clear distinctions between them. In the same vein, Dumbledore had the domains of fire, alchemy, and magic, from what Nick knew of the man. It should be clarified that having more domains didn't necessarily mean more powerful, as in fact the opposite was normally true. Having fewer domains meant far less time and effort to elevate one's understanding and mastery of their domains to a higher level. Where Nick had to separate his energy between 8 domains, Dumbledore split his between 3 or possibly 4, so he obviously had much faster progress in them than Nick did. Or at least that would be the case if Nick wasn't cheating by having a system that let him have access to resources Dumbledore had no hope of matching: books on subjects from other worlds, materials from other worlds, crafting methods and styles from other worlds, and all of the same things from this one. There was a vast gap between the resources available to each of them, and it showed as Nick was rapidly catching up to the old man, while the old goat could only rely on his own effort and severely limited resources to improve himself. Needless to say, if Nick didn't have the system, his own growth would probably slow down to around the same level as the old goat's, if perhaps a little faster, due to the knowledge and skill he already possessed. Anyway, Nick had nowhere near the amount of mastery required to snatch the ingredients from the past, which left him little choice, beyond sucking it up and shelling out the points the system gouges for the ingredients he couldn't get through the vampires.